Chapter 1098. At the end of the recollection, the footsteps of the cabin in the woods did not stop. Just like a stroll, he casually moved forward, walked half a circle without a trace, turned around nimbly and smoothly, and walked in the direction of the gate. Without changing his face, he smiled and waved to everyone he knew. Then, the hand in the trouser pocket quietly broke the copperplate to ask for help from Huaishur. Finally, he dialed his mobile phone. After waiting for the sound to pass once, it became a busy tone. All signals sent to the outside world were coldly and carefully blocked. His smile was stiff for a moment. Look up. On the road outside the gate, a strange figure covered in a protective suit appeared. His face was hidden behind a gas mask, and behind the lens, there was only darkness. Nothing could be seen. His whole body was surrounded by an ominous aura that made the small house in the forest feel creepy. At this moment, the strange newcomer was standing in the crowd, but other than him, no one else paid any attention to him. The dull electronic voice had no ups and downs. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Lin," he said calmly. "You can call me 008. In order to avoid misunderstanding, please don't do unnecessary things. Things here have nothing to do with you. I'm sorry to disturb you." The cabin in the woods smiled awkwardly, as if he had accidentally walked into the wrong toilet, and waved his hand. I'll go. Considering that your 6 personality simulations have made things develop beyond the plan, please allow me to use the 6-level adjustment plan. In short, 008 said stiffly, "Please sleep first." At that moment, in his hand, there was a stick as thick as a pencil, and he pointed it at the face of the cabin in the woods. The young man's face remained unchanged, and he disappeared in an instant. Then, he appeared in front of 008. The curse in the shadow protruded from his fingertips, condensed into a slender blade, aimed at his face, and cut down. "Idiot!" Inside the ring on his finger, he roared. "You're not qualified to keep your measly tricks, snap." His voice disappeared in an instant, and in the front end of the stick in 008's hand, it released a light like a flashlight, which disappeared in a flash. However, under the cover of the light, the small house in the woods felt that the many evil beasts that it kept in its shadow, the cursed armor that wrapped around its soul, and even the medium that was hidden all over its body had all disappeared without a trace. Even the divine mark itself. In a short moment, he was beaten back to his original form, becoming a youth that could be seen everywhere. Then, he froze in midair, unable to move. Cough about that. He blinked innocently. "It's a misunderstanding, brother. It's all a misunderstanding." "Huh." The light flashed again, and his eyes gradually dimmed and lost their luster. Memory cleared, thinking reorganization, hibernation setting, gravity grab. Under the wave of that slender pencil stick, an invisible force pulled the small house in the forest, brought him into the training hall, and finally sent him to the bed. Snoring sounds could be heard. 5 hours later, a messenger from the dojo knocked on Huaishur's door respectfully. "Mr. Huaishur." The messenger bowed respectfully and presented the name card and visiting card from the Sword Saint with both hands. "Teacher, please see me." Huaishur got up from the chair. Recently, the Sword Saint Shangchuan had been living in seclusion. In addition to gradually handing over the dojo and other powers, his physical condition was deteriorating day by day. According to the small house in the woods, he was about to die. The High Emperor also claimed to be sick and refused to see him. Why did he come here all of a sudden? But no matter what, etiquette could not be neglected. With Mr. Shangchuan's identity and condition, why did you lower yourself to come here? Huaishur took the name card and nodded in response. "As a junior, there's no need for an elder to come here personally. Since I'm free today, why don't you take me to the dojo to visit?" But the messenger's words stunned him for a long time. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Huaishur. Teacher has arrived and is downstairs." When Huaishur lifted the blinds and looked out of the window, he saw the car parked in front of the building. There were no signs, emblems, or even license plates. No one came out of the car. Through the window, the scene behind was blurry. Even with his eyesight and perception, he could not perceive anything. What's more, this feeling, Huaishur's heart sank. The Continuation Academy? He asked. I don't know about other things, and it's not something I should inquire about or know. The messenger bowed and asked earnestly, Mr. Huaishur, please come with me for a chat. He's already downstairs. How can I not see him? Huaishur shook his head and pushed the door open. He was not worried about the Sword Saint's intentions. Although the Continuation Academy had a terrible reputation, he had been in and out many times without seeing them do anything to him. Instead, he was more confused about how Sword Saint Shanchuan got involved with them. As a result, as soon as he went downstairs, he saw a decrepit old man with an oxygen mask on his face behind the open backseat door. Amidst her heavy breathing, Kamikaze raised her eyes and blinked at Huaishur as a greeting. Huaishur also nodded and saluted. Then he looked beside him. Other than the strange person with a strange gas mask on his face in the front passenger seat, the driver was actually the officer of the Ingzhou Palace inner hall. Just as Huaishur was puzzled, he saw Shanchuan raise his finger with difficulty, as if he was beckoning him to come closer. A muddy and low voice sounded from behind the mask. Don't look, kid. Don't worry. The Sword Saint's chest rose and fell violently as he panted. Do me a favor. Kill who? Huaishur subconsciously looked at the officer of the inner hall in the driver's seat, which made the middle-aged man's expression twitch, and his neck felt cold. But looking at this guy's meaty appearance, he didn't seem to be difficult. It couldn't be the guy from the looming hall, right? That would be a little troublesome. He had just killed him once some time ago, so it wasn't easy to do it. Ha! Ha! Shanchuan was amused. I'm a dignified Sword Saint. Do I still need to find you to kill someone? At the end of his sentence, he began to cough violently and stopped talking. He patted the escort beside him. The escort nodded and took out a slender iron box from the trunk. He held it with both hands. After opening it, the silent long blade was revealed. An ancient glow appeared on the long blade that had been dismantled. After a long time, the blade was still as bright as new. A ferocious phantom faintly appeared on the smooth blade. Killing intent. Peerless. With just a glance, Huaishur could feel the sharpness that had been brewing for a long time and the ferocity that was entrusted to it, as if it was choosing a person to devour. Even among the many relics at the border, it was definitely a treasure that was ranked at the top. It was not even inferior to his own origin substance equipment. Unfortunately, the origin substance in it had decayed, as if it had suffered a heavy blow. It had been sealed for too many years, and no one had used it. It was on the verge of death. After seeing the blade inscription on the blade of Mitsuyo Mike, the corner of Huaishur's eyes could not help but twitch. Grand Ceremony Tai Mitsuyo. This was one of Ingzhou's 5 swords of the world. Repair it, Shangquan asked. Can you do it? To be honest, it's a little difficult. Huaishur was silent for a moment and said straightforwardly, although the activation of Nirvana Rebirth is very convenient, I'm afraid it's not easy to find materials that can match it. The materials are provided by the Continuation Institute. The masked man in the passenger seat said in a monotonous electronic voice, You just need to ask. Then I'll give it a try. Huaishur replied, but it might not be able to guarantee success. He closed the box and took one last look at the visitors. Please follow me. 15 minutes later, the foundry center was completely empty. Under the huge foundry, the pale alchemy fire had been reignited. Huaishur lowered his head to look at the long blade in the box. He reached out and reassembled all the parts. The weathered blade let out a soft cry in his hand. It was as if it was resisting his control and unwilling to be driven by others. But in the end, it didn't have the strength to support it. Soon, it returned to silence. Huaishur also breathed a sigh of relief after a detailed inspection. It's just that the lack of source substance caused the internal miracle to collapse. He looked at the blade and felt the echo in the steel. The alchemy array and structure are not damaged at all. No, it should have been maintained, right? The craftsmanship is quite meticulous. There's no difference between it and the original part. This was to be expected. No matter how poor it was still a precious weapon of the royal family. Ingzhou's famous 5 swords of the world was an important relic that was inseparable from the country's history and past. Because of this, Huaishur wondered why they were looking for him because of this. It wasn't that Ingzhou couldn't afford to hire a grandmaster. It was just a matter of how much it would cost. Moreover, The Continuation Institute was here. For this kind of basic maintenance, it wasn't worthwhile to find an outsider like him. But since there was a sucker coming to give him money, could he back out the door and not take it? Huaisher didn't hesitate to make a list of materials that were more than 5 times the actual amount. It was up to the Continuation Institute to see if they were willing to pay. In the end, when the masked man opened the box next to him, the materials on Huaisher's list were all there. There were even 3 times more. There was definitely something wrong with these people's brains. But they gave him money when he wanted, and they gave him things when he wanted, and they brought their own materials. They even asked Xiao Huai to make some boiled noodles. He was just a business, so why should he care so much? He just had to do it. Very quickly, under Huaisher's protection, the ancient sword, which had originally been devoid of origin substance, once again had a tangible fierceness. A sharp and cold aura soared into the sky. The ancient sword emitted a high-pitched howl. Just by swinging it casually, the sharp aura caused cracks to appear on the walls and floor. Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you. Huaisher turned the long blade around and handed it over. Or, do you want to take a closer look at the effects? The masked man didn't take the item. He just nodded slightly. That's exactly what I'm here for. All right, I knew you guys would like to see this. Huaisher sighed and pushed open the door to the side. He walked into the innermost layer of the foundry center, an area formed by layers of thick walls and cages. Sensing the waves of malice coming from the relic in his hand, he sighed and raised it high again. Foundry begin. In that instant, the steel in Huaisher's right hand unfolded. The foundry formed by the Nemo engine rumbled, and a large amount of origin substance poured into it, covering every inch of the steel from the inside out, bestowing miracles, forging, rebirth, and even activation. A terrifying gravitational force appeared on the blade. The greedy Taodai sucked away 1/3 of Huaisher's origin substance in an instant. Then, after being given enough power, the grand ceremony Tai Guangshi in his hand erupted with power and flew out of his hand. In an instant, it was nailed into the center of the ground. Then, the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other could be heard. The narrow blade suddenly began to expand, and a huge arm several meters long suddenly stretched out from it, grabbing the ground and leaving 4 deep ravines. Then a second arm, an incomparably huge body, and even a head. In the end, amidst the proliferation of countless iron lights, an ear-piercing roar suddenly burst forth. The last shackles were violently torn apart. A huge shadow slowly rose, and a pair of amber vertical pupils drooped down, coldly looking at the overconfident maintainer in front of him. It was like an ape or a baboon, but it was wearing armor and feet that only generals had. Its slender face was painted with bright oil, and the hair all over its body stood up like copper needles. When they collided with each other, sparks flew from the friction. The steel ape, which was more than 10 meters tall and wore a sunwheel crown on its head, propped up its body and wantonly vented its violent ferocity. Then, it raised its hand and violently smashed Huaisher, who was close at hand. Huaisher was expressionless. Just as he was about to make a move, he heard footsteps coming from behind him. A withered hand stretched out from behind him, lifted up, and opened its slightly trembling 5 fingers, taking this earth-shattering blow head-on. It stood still. When Huaisher turned around in shock, he saw the withered figure behind him. His face was covered with wrinkles and age spots, drooling, white hair in a mess, and there was still a socket for an indwelling needle on his arm. Sword Saint Shan Chuan, very good. Huaisher, you did very good. The Sword Saint, who was clearly on the verge of death, stepped forward. After passing him, he finally said, "For the next matter, you just need to stand aside." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand. Behind him, an attendant rushed over, knelt on the ground, and offered an ordinary katana with both hands. The moment the katana fell into the withered hand, it burst forth with a sound that was not inferior to the 5 swords of the world. "Hey, I haven't seen you for so many years." Under the shroud of white hair, the old face grinned and laughed amidst the fine, choking coughs. "You, this guy, haven't been well?" The great ape looked down. Looking down at the pale human in front of him, He frowned, but soon seemed to remember something and gradually came to a realization. He actually spoke in a human voice. "It's you again, Shan. You're already so old, yet you still don't want to be lonely?" "Yes." The sword saint nodded, drooling like silk, just like you. "If that's the case, then die like a swordsman." The great ape said, "I'll help you." "Thank you." The sword saint laughed. "However, you're still far." At that moment, the old man swung his sword. It was clearly deep underground, separated by countless obstacles, but at this moment, the people present clearly heard the whistling sound from the sky above, like a hurricane sweeping past. Then, the blade flashed and disappeared, and the sound spread, like a magnificent bell from a palace. It was deafening. The great ape staggered a step back, and a deep crack appeared on its armor and body. "This move is called sort of Sky City," Shan asked without turning his head. "Did you see it clearly?" Huaisha nodded. "How much have you learned?" Shan asked again. Huaisha thought for a moment and shrugged helplessly. "I can only say that I've learned a little." "Heh, a guy with no comprehension." The sword saint shook his head, as if he had given up the idea of teaching on the spot. His two hands held the hilt of the sword tightly, and he raised it high, aiming at the opponent in front of him. The famous sword of the world after being activated, the crystallization of slaughter left behind by countless swordsmen in the history of Yingzhou. It was like looking down on him. "Roar, come!" Tai Guangshi grinned. The great iron ape did not care about the new wounds on its body. When it raised its hands that resembled a human's, endless water blades of nothingness were aimed at Shan face from afar. They were in a stalemate, in the dead silence. Only the air let out waves of mournful wails. When the nothingness wills collided with each other in this narrow cage, everything was frozen by the bone-piercing, killing intent. Huaisha could not help but take a step back. He could feel what was brewing in that old body, the weakened origin substance, the soul on the verge of collapse, the dying body, and even the disordered breathing, the difficult heartbeat. None of this could stop the power sleeping in the darkness from truly awakening. That thing called will. The nothingness's will, at this moment, reversed reality, shook all souls, and intimidated all enemies. It was like a scorching sun rising from the old man's body, blooming with endless power. At this moment, when the blade of the sword slashed down, it shot out a dazzling evil intent and killing intent that made the soul tremble. It created death. After an instant of collision, Shan sheathed his sword. Behind him, the shadow of the great ape silently dispersed. Only two broken pieces of the long sword were left on the ground, and countless cracks broke into pieces. They turned into dust. There was no room for repair. The old man who returned to the wheelchair put on the oxygen mask again. The medicine from the Preservation Institute flowed into his body bit by bit, maintaining this body that was riddled with holes from collapsing in a short period of time. And Shan spoke again. "Next." So, the follower stepped forward again and presented the iron box to Huaisha. Under the entanglement of layers of Buddha beads, the sharp blade in the box still emitted bursts of evil and strange aura. The bloody light flowed and cried out hungrily. Blade inscription Eternity. It was also one of the 5 swords in the world, Juzumaru Eternity. After a short silence, Huaisha could not help but turn around and ask, "Let me guess, are there 3 more?" It was just as he had said. At the feet of the Preservation Institute's strange person, 3 overlapping iron boxes quietly appeared. "Please continue, Mr. Huaisha," he said. "The data collection has just begun." Chapter 1099. Since the Continuation Academy asked him to continue, then he would continue. Huaisha unceremoniously took a tube of source essence from the box and poured it into his mouth. After replenishing a portion of his mana bar, he stuffed the rest of the items into his pocket. Since the wool was delivered to his door, he would harvest it. The visitor from the Continuation Academy was indifferent, as if he didn't see it at all and didn't care at all. He was just waiting for the next data and results. Casting restart. This time, in Huaisha's hand, Juzumaru disappeared without a trace after a whisper, as if it had evaporated without warning. But at that moment, Huaishir felt her hair stand on end. She heard soft footsteps behind her, but there was nothing there. Everyone present felt a chill rising in their hearts. Next to the sword master's wheelchair, the attendant who accompanied him had already stiffened in place. He felt a chill close at hand, and his whole body was frozen. Just behind the white-haired old man, in the dim shadow, a faint outline emerged. It looked like a monk wearing a bamboo hat, draped in a dark red robe, with layers of prayer beads wrapped around his wrist and neck. But his face was hidden in the shadow under the bamboo hat. Only a faint bloody light outlined the position of his eyes. He was lowering his head, overlooking the old man's back. Kamikaze didn't respond, and even his turbid eyes didn't waver. "What's wrong, fake monk?" he asked hoarsely. "Are you thinking of enlightening me?" "It's too late." The monk shook his head indifferently. "Benefactor's obsession is blazing. Your 6 roots are dirty, and your sins are deep. You have already fallen into the realm of Avicii calling. Dharma is already at its wit's end. Then what are you waiting for?" Kamikaze sneered, tapping the scabbard in front of his knees. He deliberately stretched his neck and exposed his dry and slender neck. "I have long heard that Jizumru is a sword that kills souls and slays evil," he said. "Please try to slay an evil spirit like me. That's how it should be." The bloodstained monk raised his hand and took off his bamboo hat. From his face, shrouded in bloody fire, a fanaticism of joy emerged. He murmured hoarsely, "Avatar Samyak Sambodhi." At that moment, the blood-red and evil aura faded away. A pure blade appeared from the scabbard and slashed towards the sword saint's neck. The illusory light flashed and disappeared. His speed had already surpassed that of lightning and was comparable to the circulation of thoughts and thoughts. No, it was even faster than that. This was because what was chopped down was not an actual substance, but a blade of bubbles created by the essence of awareness and compassion. Wherever the blade passed, all evil karma, all filth, all impurities, and all delusions were destroyed. A deathly silence descended. In a long silence, Shang Quan remained silent. She closed her eyes slightly and sighed silently. A cracking sound could be heard behind him. The sword-wielding monk froze on the spot. Blood flowed out, and the flames were extinguished. Cracks appeared on the blurry face as he staggered back a step. He was clearly not the one who was beheaded, but it was hard to suppress this cry of fear. The bubble burst, and the sword of destroying evil and revealing righteousness collapsed silently. Resolution and compassion could not cut away the opponent's arrogance and obsession, but were instead destroyed by the steel-like mastery in the soul. Righteousness. Shang Quan shook his head. That's all there is to it. Behind him, the monk in the shadow silently dissipated, leaving behind a long, rusty knife that no longer shone. After losing the essence of guardian and compassion, it fell to the mortal world. There was no possibility of recovery. Next, Shang Quan looked down sleepily. "At least give me something that won't make me yawn." Huaishir turned around and looked at the open box behind him. The 3 dust-covered sharp blades clanged in the sword saint's whispers. Evil, ferocious, solemn. All kinds of auras spread like flames. He closed his eyes and casually took one out. Then he raised his eyebrows. "Tongji Yasunoki?" Huaishir sighed softly. "This should be able to cheer up the old pretentious senior, right?" 5 minutes later, the expressionless Shang Quan returned to the wheelchair. Next, damn it, he was pretentious again. Then, it was the next one, and the one after that, from the ruthless and fierce giant steel ape, Odin Taigwa, who wanted to hold everything in the world in his hands, to the soft and strange sort of guardian, Jizumu, who devoured all evil, to the evil sword, Tongji Yasunoki, who sealed the former wine into the blade and turned disaster into power, to the sword of the king, Mikazuki Munakika, who held hegemony and broke mountains. And finally, the sword of pure slaughter, Onamaru Kakazuna, who killed all evil and endless evil. In less than an hour, the 5 swords of the world were all destroyed in front of the sword saint. What he used was only the unparalleled swordsmanship that could frighten ghosts and frighten gods, which was an eye-opener for Huai Shi. The sword of the heavenly city that could reach the heavens with a single thought. The sword of the heavenly city that was unparalleled and domineering. The saber of the sun that could shatter a city. The ever-changing illusion of the real and the illusory. The endless split light bubbles. The battle of life and death. The collapsing momentum. With just a casual swing, Huai Shi saw a lofty world that he had never imagined. After struggling at death's door for so many years, the old body still contained the ambition to cut down the sun and the moon, and the skills that Huai Shi could not reach. It had nothing to do with Elder Luo always saying that Huai Shi lacked comprehension, and compared with the real strong, the talents he possessed were still far behind. But who would want to compete with others in this? If someone wanted to beat him, unless someone jumped out and played a cello song that no one had ever played before or since, even Huai Shi would refuse to flatter him. But was there really such a person in this world? Well, maybe there was such an old monster hidden in the headquarters of the Music Association of All Hells. But even if there was, the cello was such an unpopular instrument. No one would have such attainments as Huai Shi, right? It could only be said that being invincible was so lonely. With the thought of sacred swordsman, not bad. Huai Shi applauded along with the crowd. As for Shang Xuan, who was standing on the field and stepping on the gradually dissipating race corpse, she was moved by the cheers and applause. She only turned around and looked at the guest from the Continuation Academy, who stood beside her without saying a word. "How is it?" the stooped old man asked in a hoarse voice. "Is this old man's sword acceptable?" "It's enough." The mysterious man who called himself 008 nodded, and his electronic voice was flat. "It's 30% better than expected. It seems that aging didn't make you weaker, and after so many years of entanglement with death, you've become stronger." "Stronger? How am I strong?" Shang Quan sneered and shook his head. "Can I be considered strong just by winning a few rounds against that kind of dead thing? It's too ridiculous. The so-called swordsmanship is, in essence, a way to kill people. Only a living person can show its essence." As he spoke, his pair of muddy old eyes looked at Huai Shi, who was watching the fun and eating, making Huai Shi's expression stiffen. "After watching the monkey show for so long, you have to leave something behind, right, Huai Shi?" Shang Quan coughed and smiled faintly. "That indifferent look, you don't put me in your eyes at all, wait." Huai Shi subconsciously raised his hand and said solemnly, "I have a good disciple, surnamed Lin and named Zhonghua. He's very talented, and his strength is the best among his peers. Why don't we let him play a few rounds with sacred swordsmen?" "No." Shang Quan shook his head. "I'm still waiting for that kid to marry into the family, so that I can manage the dojo in the future. If he's scared, wouldn't that girl Yao Xiang be sad? Then why don't you go find Qilin, find the old man of the Yuan family, or find Luo Siwei in hell?" Huai Shi glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. Until now, how could he not figure out what kind of dogskin plaster this old man was selling in his gourds? "Sacred swordsman, it's fine that you're doing rehabilitation exercises, but can't you find something more difficult? Why use me, a junior, as a stepping stone?" "It's because I won't lose that I specifically looked for you, Huai Shi," Shang Quan replied frankly. "I can't be too strong, or I'll strain my muscles and bones. I can't be too weak, or I won't be able to perform at all. It just so happens that I have you, neither strong nor weak, within the range of this old man." He thought for a moment, and said seriously, "This is the art of war. Well, your Ingzhou's art of war is only about teaching people how to eat and beating the cooks, right?" Seeing that the old man stopped coughing when he thought of beating the weak, Huai Shi felt that he might not be able to escape today. He sighed. "Have you thought it through?" "Haha, don't worry." Shang Quan grinned. "I'll be merciful. No, I just want to remind you." Huai Shi slowly got up from the chair, patted the non-existent dust on his knees and buttocks, and moved his body. "Apart from being smelly and hard as a stepping stone, I'm also a bit slippery. Be careful, old man. If you don't step firmly, you might sprain your ankle." Shang Quan was slightly stunned, and then he couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. "I like the way you boast shamelessly, Huai Shi. You seem to always be full of vitality, hope, and the future. He sighed sincerely. Every time I meet a junior like you, it makes me feel happy from the bottom of my heart. Is that so? Huaishur walked into the field indifferently, closed the door behind him, and answered perfunctorily, "That's too happy." "That's right." The old man paused for a moment, grinned, and revealed a cruel smile that was exactly the same as Luo Siwei's. "Especially every time I think about what kind of frustration and despair those hopeful faces will show in a while, it makes me so excited that I can't control myself. When I think about how some people will not dare to hold a sword for the rest of their lives under my attack, and will tremble in nightmares for the rest of their lives, it makes me so excited that my stomach rumbles. And I can't be full when a calf is born. It really sees the ferocity of a tiger, when a boastful guy really understands the majesty of a mountain. When he sees the tragic corpses of countless fellow travelers who died with their eyes open, when he luckily escapes from the blade of a sword and spends the rest of his life eternally in the shadow. This fear that is engraved in the hearts of the weak is the only way to prove strength. The words he said were obviously so ugly and ferocious, but the old man's expression was so solemn and solemn. The so-called swordsmanship, the so-called fighting, the so-called skills. After removing all the high-sounding excuses, all the ways of fighting in the world exist for this reason. In the silence, Huaishur couldn't help but shake his head. "To be honest, I'm not interested in your reasons. However, at this point, even if I say that I'm actually a musician, you certainly won't let me go, right? So, I only have one question." He paused for a moment, looked outside, and asked seriously, "Do you reimburse me?" 008 nodded without hesitation. 10 times, he said. At that moment, Huaishur narrowed his eyes with a smile and no longer had any scruples. In this way, he took the first step toward the Sword Saint, toward the peak that no martial artist in the present state could surpass. "So barehanded?" The Sword Saint sneered. "Where's your Tian Ke, Huaishur? Why don't you take out your Nautilus and show it to people? Isn't it already in front of you, Your Excellency Sword Saint?" At that moment, Huaishur raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The whole steel building roared, and layers of heavy structures quickly turned over. Huge equipment rose and fell, and countless cables extended rapidly. When huge modules collided with each other, blazing sparks burst out. With the crisp snap of the fingers, the whole world seemed to be resonating in a low voice. As far as the eye could see, the steel sky and earth, the whole structure buried deep in the ground, and even the casting center protruding from the ground were just an extension of the Nautilus. Here, it has long been covered by the Tian Ke. Now, the huge main gun suddenly protruded from the ceiling above Huaishur's head, aiming at the unsuspecting old man in front of him. With the roar of the tide, that Nemo's engine had already run to the limit, brazenly firing. Chapter 1100. After the maintenance and repair of the ivory tower, the main cannon of the Nautilus, cross-depth strike mass weapon, whaling harpoon, was also brand new. Although due to the limitations of funds and materials, it was temporarily impossible to create a special cannonball that could severely injure and shackle some small rulers. Grandmaster Mikhail still left the Sky Fortress, which was about to be finished, in his busy schedule, and specially made a total of 48 heavy mass annihilation curse bullets for it. Of course, the war tool that could vaporize half of the ivory tower in one shot was absolutely impossible to use on the Sword Saint. Otherwise, if he was not careful, the old senior would be gone, and Huaishur himself would probably be finished. He did not even use the hellish annihilation missiles that were used to wipe out the ground. He just purely extracted the origin substance, and in a very short distance, in this short moment, carried out a combined attack. Under the push of the Nemo engine, dozens of origin substance armaments cracked in the furnace. A sea of disasters and miracles collided with each other, completely stimulating the qualitative change of light and shadow, gathering into a turbulent light and shooting. A large amount of metal vapor condensed into iron sand that shone like stardust, mixed in, and formed a storm that could penetrate all defenses. At this moment, the mighty light rushed over, illuminating the thin figure. Shan Chuan raised his hand and casually slashed down. The sound of the tide stopped abruptly, as if it was also killed by the solemn while surging on the blade. The stream of light opened up under the blade and flew out to both sides, burning a large piece of heat-resistant armor. Viscous iron flowed down, sizzling. It's like a cool breeze, very comfortable. Shan Chuan held the blade, his thin neck supporting his head, and laughed strangely. Why sure, Cohen, are you such a gentle person? That's great. I like opponents who are reasonable like you the most. Reasonable? Why sure was expressionless. How is this him being reasonable? It was clearly that old thing opposite him who was being unreasonable. That's also supreme? He asked curiously. That also needs to be supreme? Shan Chuan glanced at the scorched marks on both sides and sneered in between coughs. It's just going with the flow, breaking it open like flowing water. Do you need more advanced skills? A drop of sticky saliva fell from the corner of his mouth and landed on his collar. It carried the muddy stench unique to old people. The stains were like plum blossoms. Run, why sure? He said vaguely. I'm going over. In that instant, a premonition of death suddenly burst forth from his soul. When the skinny old man took a step forward, his aged face suddenly crossed the long distance and was very close to him. He couldn't hear the sound of air being torn apart, and he couldn't feel the tiny tremors when his feet collided with the ground. Even his messy white hair didn't flutter or change at all. It was as if space had been abruptly omitted. Huaishi's position was also omitted, along with his permission. Without asking for his permission, an invisible force sent him to his opponent. And there, in Shan Chuan's hands, the blade that had fallen to the ground flipped slightly. The blade rose upwards, aiming for Huaishi's crotch, abdomen, chest, throat, and even his head. It was not a terrifying sword technique, but a basic sword technique that was so standard that it could even be called rigid. Against the wind, but in Shan Chuan's hands, it was as if an angry star had broken free from the ground and rose towards the sky, exuding a frightening and fierce aura. The ground trembled. Huaishi suddenly stomped on the ground. His body leaned backwards, and he flew backwards, narrowly dodging this greeting sword. Immediately after, the ground beneath his feet shattered, and an angry, burning bull rose from the ground, charging towards the sword saint. The sound of metal scraping against metal flashed past. Shan Chuan expressionlessly took a step to the left, stepping on the scorching ground. The raised blade seemed to be waiting for his opponent to come to him. The origin substance incarnation was cut open from the side by the impact. A deep crack appeared in the flesh and bones that were comparable to steel. Very quickly, it dissipated into the void. Without waiting for the sword saint to react, Huaishi waved his hand. From the cracked ceiling, countless pieces of metal rained down like a storm. Under Yun Zhongjuan's will, they chaotically flew towards Shan Chuan. But before he could land on the ground, he saw a heart-chilling flash of metal flash past. Hundreds and thousands of cubes of metal ingots cracked open from the center. The cracks were as smooth as a mirror. After they escaped Huaishi's control, they piled up on the ground. Among the countless pieces of metal, Shan Chuan raised his eyes. He sighed regretfully. I told you to run. Standing in place, he raised his blade and aimed it at Huaishi's face in the air, assuming a sudden thrust. In the next instant, the light of the blade shot forward like a shooting star. In less than the blink of an eye, it crossed a long distance and got close again. An immense pressure rose from the blade. A terrifying will that seemed to have substance completely seal the air, not allowing any escape or dodging. Just like that, it approached Huaishi's face inch by inch. When a metal light on the blade appeared on the reflection in Huaishi's eyes, a biting cold lightning suddenly rose from the pitch-black darkness. Burst forth. There was a loud roar. Without any warning, a blazing lightning fell from the sky and struck Shan Chuan's figure. The moment Huaishi clasped her hands together, the countless iron ingots that had been sliced closed under her will, forming two iron walls that closed in on the old man in front of her. Then, the lightning shattered, and the iron walls broke from the middle at the waist. Wisps of dissipating lightning dissipated. Shang Xuan stepped on the broken wall, leaving a scorched mark on one of his sleeves. He lowered his head, looked at the red-hot blade in his hand, and spat out a mouthful of thick phlegm with faint traces of blood. "It's not good to spit on the ground, Senior Shang Xuan." Huaisher sighed softly. "I heard that people from Yingzhou are the most polite. You didn't put up a sign forbidding spitting on the ground." Shang Quan replied nonchalantly. She glanced at the lightning that was suddenly flickering in and out of his body. "This is the only move that's exciting, brat. It's best if you're satisfied." Huaisher smiled. "Of course, if you think it's enough, I can also welcome you with open arms. This is just the end of the warm-up, Huaisher." Shang Quan waved his hand, and the red-hot sword broke into two. He threw it to the side without any pity. Then, he hooked his finger at Huaisher and said, "I heard that your goods are pretty good. But why haven't you taken the initiative to offer a gift since you've been standing here for so long?" Huaisher couldn't help but sigh. The old man was indeed the old man, and his style was extraordinary. It was fine that he came here to beat people up, but he even asked the victim to provide him with the tools to commit the crime. He even made it seem like it was an honor to be beaten up. "Don't worry, sir. I'm still preparing," he patiently persuaded. "I'm just worried that there are too many things, and I'm afraid that it's not easy for you to carry them." Before he finished speaking, another thunderous roar erupted from the top of the sky. Thick water vapor rose to the top of the sky against the earth. In an instant, it turned into a dark cloud. Thunder and lightning flashed, and a cold and mournful light flashed. Then a slender blade slowly emerged from the thunder and lightning and poked out from the clouds. Then, the second, third, fourth, and fifth rays of light appeared after a few short moments. The sky was filled with iron light, and countless katanas had been aimed at the old man's skinny figure. They were entwined with wisps of lightning, showing off their sharpness. "Do as you wish." Huaisher smiled and spread his hands. "You can take as many as you want." At that moment, the iron rain fell to the ground and swallowed everything in an instant. But in Huaisher's eyes, everything seemed to be unbelievably slow. Under the gaze of full concentration, he could see the old man casually stretching out his palm toward the sky. He easily closed his fingers and clamped down on a sharp blade that was heading straight for his face. Then, he casually tossed it towards Huaisher. It was an easy movement, but it burst out with a loud sound that was enough to suppress the thunder in the sky. After the katana that was spinning in the air cut down countless of its kind, it swept toward Huaisher's head. Then Huaisher grasped the handle of the katana and suspended it in the air. The blade was covered with cracks and instantly shattered into dust. However, amidst the rain of swords that filled the sky, the old man laughed loudly and took a step forward. His hands casually held a large number of weapons, and he swung them casually, slashing them and destroying all the weapons that came stabbing at him and the blades that were nailed to the ground. When the two katanas were in his hands, it seemed that the world was also spinning with his movements. The hurricane rose out of thin air and retreated in all directions. Countless sharp blades flew out and nailed to every inch of the earth. Behind the wheelchair, the attendant staggered back. In front of countless flying sharp blades, 008 was motionless. His body was like a phantom, letting countless sharp blades pass through, indifferent. As for Huaisher, he had been engulfed by the storm. Yes, an indescribable storm that was like a natural disaster and could not be avoided. It was right in front of him. In his perception, the old man, who seemed to be about to fall dead in the next moment, began to dissolve, collapse, and spread. He detached from the outline of a person and turned into an amorphous, indescribable, all-pervasive storm. When the two blades crisscrossed and chopped down, the storm of nothingness briefly projected a fatal gap from reality. But more often, it could not be locked and detected at all. Where was the enemy? It was everywhere. The whole world had become his enemy. Under the sprinkling of Shang Xuan, even the steel created by Huaisher had turned into a blade that could devour its owner. In his hands, the pure and basic sword skills were better than all secret skills and profound knowledge. Tangju against the wind, Kasaya chop, reverse Kasaya, horizontal cut, stab. It was obviously a beat that they had long been familiar with and used to, but in Shang Quan's hands, it performed a terrifying chapter that Huaishir had never expected. Around Huaishir, afterimages constantly flashed. Blades, swords, axes, halberds, chains, and iron hammers. The origin substance armament was constantly changing. The incarnation appeared and disappeared immediately. The number of more than 10 times that of the opponent was easily suppressed by Shan Chuan's sword. Only the sound of steel colliding with steel constantly burst out in the air. In Shan Chuan's hands, the katana constantly cracked and collapsed under the rough use. Immediately, he casually pulled out another one from the ground and slashed at Huaishir again. Ah, the music is pleasant to the ear. The dance is wonderful. Huaishir, I visiting Yoshihara's brothel? It's all ridiculous things. The old man laughed hoarsely. Why don't I see Nautilus's bombardment? And where's your miracle engraving? What about the heavenly sword that destroyed the black tide on the endless sea? Why don't you take it out? He stepped forward, his skinny body casually closing in on her. After destroying the afterimages, he lunged forward, the sharp blade in his hand casually piercing through the air. It brushed past Huaishir's face and pierced deep into the wall. On the face, covered with age spots, the eyes had already turned scarlet under the torment of anger, like an evil spirit. There should be a limit to looking down on people, little brat. Huaishir was expressionless. He raised his hand, and the sword of virtue swept across, blocking the trajectory of Shan Chuan's slash. Your Excellency's sacred swordsman has not used the sacred mark in your own supreme until now, right? Moreover, he paused for a moment. In his hand, thunder burst out again. The entire foundry center suddenly shook, and a loud noise echoed in the ivory towers. Smoke and dust rose, and was quickly sucked away by the creator's framework. But at that moment, the entire foundry center's roar burst out, terrifying power, the thunder brewing in the thunderclouds, and the sound of countless sharp blades had gathered in Huaishir's hand. Unlimited superposition. Even the arm that had turned into a steel structure could not bear this jaw-dropping power. As the iron fist pushed forward, it brazenly defeated the sharp blades in Shan Chuan's hands. It smashed mercilessly toward his face. Mastery, symphony. At that moment, Shan Chuan finally took a step back. The ferocious smile dissipated. His skinny body slowly slid out of the erupting hurricane as if he was riding on the wind. Soon, he stood still in the midst of the swords and blades. When he looked up, he saw the figure walking out of the dust and broken iron. Surrounded by thunder and flames, Huaishir dragged the solemn, long sword in his hand and moved forward expressionlessly. He glanced at the opponent in front of him. He looked down on him. We are from the Orchard Gym. Do we need to rely on a cheat to deal with an old thing? Chapter 1101. In the brief silence, the follower behind the wheelchair couldn't help but tremble. He swallowed his saliva. Arrogance. A formless flame rose from the deathly, silent field. It was a flame of anger that seemed to have substance. It lingered on the withered old man's body. Just the will of the void ravaged the earth to the point of collapse, and cracks appeared on the steel. The Sword Saint's anger. How sad. Kamiizumi sighed. Do the young people nowadays not know how to respect the old? Huaishir shrugged slightly. I have to say, you were the one who attacked first. Those things don't matter. Kamiizumi smacked his lips, and his voice was hoarse. The point is, I suddenly don't want to be merciful. Same to you. Huaishir responded indifferently. Although he didn't want to admit it, Huaishir's defense was broken when the old man in front of him compared his skills to Yoshihara songstress game. But so what if his defense was broken? He was anxious. In any case, Huaishir didn't believe that this old man could beat him to death. Moreover, he had a way to deal with this kind of old man who had a bad personality and liked to abuse weak people. Come. He provocatively hooked his finger and grinned. Let me, a junior, experience the difference between myself and the Sword Saint of Ingzhou. Don't worry, I will use the back of the sword. Kami-Izumi answered considerately. After a short pause, he muttered vaguely as if he was talking to himself. But if you're killed by the back of the sword, you can't blame anyone else, right? Huaishir instantly stiffened. He felt a chill that seemed to have substance spit out from the old man's vague words. It spread and engulfed him like a hideous nightmare. Darkness surged out from under that old and decrepit face. Then, as the sword danced, the earth was ravaged. Deep cracks spread forward in a straight line, crossing a long distance in an instant and arriving in front of Huaishir with death. Countless steel converged, and layers of walls rose from the ground. But then they were quickly enveloped by the expanding cracks from the bottom to the top. It broke apart from the middle. The 16 layers of walls were easily sliced apart by the pressure of the wool wrapped around the sharp blade. The sharp wind cut Huaishir's face, bringing waves of stinging pain. A ray of light shone through the straight crack and shone on his face, allowing him to see the stooped figure stepping forward. But before he could catch his breath again, he heard another wail of steel. In Kamikaze's hand, the ordinary-looking katana whistled as he swung it horizontally. Instantly, the 16 layers of steel walls in front of him were torn apart once again. Half at the waist, the crisscrossing cracks turned into a flawless cross. Under the slash of the blade, the beauty of mathematics and destruction was displayed without restraint. Outside the crumbling iron wall, the old man's thin figure had already dashed forward like a ghost. With a single step, he crossed the moat that was enough to make the broken body feel despair. The blade of his ghost, god-slaying sword was already stabbing towards Huaishir's face. What responded to him was a piercingly cold lightning. It was as if all the light in the world had gathered here, forming a furious torrent in Huaishir's hand. The moment it left his hand, it was like a dragon galloping above the sky, bringing with it pure destruction as it pounced towards Kamikaze. And the dazzling lightning was like flowing water before the blade of the sword. It was easily wrapped around the blade, unable to move forward. Instead, it was subdued by the will on the blade, causing it to counterattack its own creator. The sword of 7 seas burst forth with the sound of waves. Under the impetus and acceleration of the Supreme, pure mass was scattered out from Huaishir's hand. The moment the katana and the blade collided, the lightning exploded, melting countless broken iron pieces into paste, illuminating the old man's old face and the pair of eyes filled with strange darkness. "Look, Huaishir." Kamikaze's face moved forward slightly, grinning hideously. "If the quality is insufficient, what's the use of having more?" His withered body was actually able to suppress Huaishir's 7 seas sword. He did not yield an inch in the face of this enormous power. Under his feet, the earth collapsed, and the sharp blade in his hand was also wailing, but it had created a jaw-dropping miracle. With such ordinary quality, it was able to contend against the fusion of the dual power of Ai Fong and the Sword of Virtue. Under Kamikaze's will, even if it was ordinary iron, once it was in his hands, it would be a killing tool that could compete with any divine weapon. Now, the katana that Huaishir had created himself was actually emitting a terrifying power that even Huaishir himself could not imagine. "Let me guess, you think this is supreme?" Kamikaze laughed strangely. Too rigid Huaishir. He waved his hand, easily pushing the sword of 7 seas to the side, and pierced it again. Under the bombardment of the hammer of pain, he casually took a step back, turned around, stepped on the hammer, and stepped forward, pressing on step by step. "What is supreme, Huaishir? Why have you never thought of it?" Shrill cracks spread from the wall, and under the slash of the blade from afar, Huaishir retreated pathetically. He heard the hoarse voice echoing in the wind. "Supreme is drinking water, peeing, picking up a piece of beef from chopsticks. It is something that you believe you can do, something that is natural. Everything should be like this." 100 steps away, the old man calmly glanced at his sorry appearance and sighed mockingly. "It's just that some disabled people think that if they can't do it, others shouldn't be able to do it either. Would you ask why an apple falls from a branch? Would you ask why the stars move in the night sky? Would you ask why birds are born to fly? Why is the utopia so glorious? Why can the Directorate of Governance allow everything to operate as usual? Why can the Continuation Academy seal off all disasters? Would you ask how the Astronomical Society could control the entire world? Even if it was inconceivable. But it was natural. It could be done, and it was done. As for the rest, it did not matter at all. It was not something that was unattainable, nor was there any mysterious veil. It was the crystallization of the spirit of the champion, the sole essence of the seeker, the determination of the swordsman to win. At the end of the road, Supreme was born. That was all. Is splitting the earth supreme? Is breaking steel a supreme tier? Engulfed and covered by the iron rain, he slowly moved forward as if he was taking a stroll, and casually asked, "Your symphony is supreme, but is your rhythm, your resonance supreme? Could it be that this attack of yours is representative of supreme itself? Is your breath at this moment in the category of supreme? What are you secretly brewing? Is the chime behind you supreme itself?" The sword saint laughed, clenching the tachi in his hand and slashing down. Thunder roared. The dark clouds that filled the sky dissipated under the sword, leaving only the reverberating sound of the bell. The sword of Sky City appeared once again. The terrible impact sent Huai Shi sliding back several meters. His arm cracked and blood flowed out. But he rushed forward again as if he did not feel any pain, the halberd in his hand swinging down again. At this moment, the reverberating sound of the dark clouds dissipating, the whine of the thunder when it was annihilated, the majestic sound of the entire casting center, and even the ripples caused by the frame of the ivory tower. And his heartbeat, the fluctuation of the source form, the power of the soul, and even the sacred mark all combined into one. From this stab that surpassed the past, an unprecedented brilliance bloomed. As a response, it was a sword that was like the brilliant sun rising from the horizon. Boundless brilliance, lofty sentiments that shrouded heaven and earth were entrusted to this sword. Towards the climax of the symphony, the sword slashed out. It was the peerless sword technique that destroyed the entire border of Lava Island in the past with one strike. Blade of the Sun. Look, that's it, Huai Shi. In the spreading of the terrifying waves, the old man's white hair danced in the wind, laughing excitedly because of the breakthrough of the opponent in front of him. You used it as the trump card to win, but you never realized that it was you. Remember, I'm supreme. Clearly, he had a new understanding of his own power again. Clearly, he was one step closer. But Huai Shi did not feel joy in his heart at this moment, because of the old man in front of him. Like lava spewing out from a dormant volcano again, there seemed to be a dazzling light in his dark eyes. Now, the teaching time is over. Shang Quan took a step forward and easily defeated Huai Shi's counterattack again. Next, it's time to suffer. Boom! Under the slash of the back of the sword, the flail formed by the snake and the wolf's head wailed and was defeated and sent flying backward. The blade of resentment whistled and stabbed out again, but it was blocked by Shang Quan again. Haydn's symphony at dusk collapsed under the impact of this dissonant sound. Too straightforward, too violent, Huai Shi. He shook his head in disdain. Other than the way a drummer uses his strength, there's no technique to speak of. But what responded to him was the soul-stirring four tones of fate knocking on the door. The combination of the sword of seven seas, the explosive hammer, the halberd, and the strange sword rose from the ground and shattered the old man's sword without warning, breaking through Shang Quan's defense and driving straight in. For the first time, he was forced to take a step back. But then, under the block of the broken sword, it stopped in front of Shang Quan's neck. "This is art, old man. You don't know how to appreciate it, do you?" Huai Shi shook his head and retorted sarcastically, "It's fine as long as it's useful. Don't be too calculative." The sword of seven seas slashed down again. The sound of waves and waves gathered on the blade, and the impact of the mass pushed the old man back again, sliding a few meters away. But still, he did not hit his target. "Neck, you're too stubborn about decapitation, boy." He raised his hand and touched his shriveled and slender neck. It was like a stalk of wheat that would break with the slightest bit of force. But it was this broken body that was on the verge of death that had beaten Huaishur to the point where she was unable to retaliate. Now, he threw away the broken sword in his hand, pulled out another one from the ground, and casually waved it twice. Let me teach you a principle in place of Luo Siwei. Chapter 1102. In an instant, it seemed that the whole world was silent. Huaishur's lungs were instinctively convulsing. At this moment, in front of him, there was mockery, contempt, disdain, and even malice. The shriveled old man's body emitted a premonition of death that caused Huaishur to shudder. Decapitation? Decapitation? The old man raised the long saber in his hand carefully, as if he was protecting some rare treasure. He was gentle and careful, but it made his opponent's hair stand on end, and he couldn't help but tremble. If you want to kill the enemy, why do you have to go through so much trouble? Shan Chuan whispered softly, as long as you can kill the soul. In that instant, the complete tachi in his hand silently turned into powder. It twisted until it broke apart, and it was completely unrecognizable and disappeared without a trace. But what replaced it was a cold light condensed by some kind of will and soul. His eyes couldn't see, his body couldn't touch, and he couldn't feel, but Huaishur's soul clearly saw the scene that could reverse reality and illusion. It was the blade of nothingness forged by the will of the Sword Saint. It was dozens of meters away, but it made Huaishur's vision go black. It was like an ordinary person standing in front of a huge cannon, locked on by a power that could destroy everything. Being aimed at by such a blade, he couldn't breathe at all. Now, the old man, who was holding the sword of killing souls, took a step forward and crossed the insignificant distance. The blade of nothingness in his hand swept across Huaishur's body like a breeze. It brought with it coldness and pain, as if it were solid, the horrible touch when his flesh was cut by steel, and the despair when his life was taken away. The divine mark, soul, power, everything seemed to have left Huaishur. They were all like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. His consciousness was blank. He could only watch in despair as the sword of killing souls penetrated his body, disintegrating all his defenses, and went straight in, penetrating the layers of defense of the ultimate in the celestial palace. In the end, it stopped abruptly in front of Huaishur's soul. However, the moment they came into contact with each other, it left behind a sense of fear and gloom that came from the peak of the way of the sword. It was a gap of despair that could be carved into one's heart for a lifetime. In the dead silence, Huaishur froze in place. The light in his eyes gradually extinguished, and his consciousness was already blank. Victory and defeat had been decided. Right in front of him, Shan Chuan took one last look at him and shook her head. Disaster sword? It's just SOSO. Filled with the disappointment of not being able to use his full strength and the satisfaction of being able to abuse the weak, he sneered and turned to leave. However, after taking 2 steps, his movements came to an abrupt stop. There was a pause. As if he had discovered something inconceivable, he turned around in astonishment. Behind him, the dazed young man, the opponent who should have fainted, had completely fainted under the intimidation of the soul-slaying sword, Huaishur. His drooping finger twitched and twitched again. In this momentary blankness of his consciousness and soul, the remnant stubbornness still drove his body to raise his palm. It was as if he was holding an invisible pistol. He used all his strength. He pulled a non-existent trigger. At that moment, the smile on Shan Chuan's face disappeared without a trace. It was as if he had seen the bullet shot by Huaishur. He clenched the non-existent tachi and slashed it down. It was clearly a non-existent counterattack and block, but everyone present seemed to have produced the high-pitched sound of an iron blade colliding with a bullet. After that strike, Huaishur did not move again. After a long time, a faint light appeared in his empty eyes again. He woke up from a long nightmare and tried his best to breathe. When he lowered his head, he saw his raised palm. He gradually understood. "Look, Senior." He smiled and sighed softly. "Even if the soul is dead, There are still people who can move. He raised his head and reminded him seriously, don't let your guard down against the younger generation. Shan Chuan looked at him. In a short silence, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. It was hoarse and sharp, causing his decaying lungs to cough in the laughter, shaking out an empty echo. Very good, Huaishir. You're very good. Shan Chuan did not hide his admiration and surprise at all. He shook his head and praised, with just this sword, in the future world, you will definitely have achievements that will not be inferior to anyone, or death that will not be inferior to anyone. Huaishir was at a loss. He looked at his hand that was holding the gun. Is this a sword? It's just a tool. What's the difference in what it's called? Shan Chuan shook his head indifferently. Besides, isn't the sword that you stabbed at me your unique counterattack? Just like that, he let out a long sigh and staggered away slowly. He walked out of the collapsed and broken door and returned to his chair again. The medical staff, who had been waiting for a long time, rushed up and put an oxygen mask on the dying body again. They injected life-saving drugs and carefully and hurriedly bandaged and repaired the wounds. However, they could not stop the cracks from appearing on Shan Chuan's body. He had long been on the verge of his limit. After breaking through the limit, only destruction was left. Save it. It's hopeless. Behind the mask, Shan Chuan said vaguely. He glanced at the feudal guys beside him and finally looked at 008. I still have half a month, no, about 13 days. I hope your arrangements can be more efficient. Enough. 008 nodded and replied. Then, do you want to come with us now? What should be arranged has been arranged. Shan Chuan replied without any attachment. It's time to go. Don't waste time. 008 nodded. Behind him, the door of nothingness suddenly opened. Two rows of figures wearing chemical protective suits and gas masks like him came out. After pushing away the obstructing medical staff, they pushed Shan Chuan's wheelchair and turned to walk into the darkness behind the door. At the end, Shan Chuan looked to Huaishir again. A hoarse farewell. That child Yao Xiang, please take care of her in the future. Just like that, he disappeared behind the door. The door closed, and he could no longer be seen. The parting came so abruptly and so suddenly that it caught her off guard. Huaishir was stunned for a long time. Finally, he looked at 008, who stayed in place. What are you going to do? A gamble. 008's electronic voice replied. Mr. Huaishir, you are also on the list of candidates. He looked down at the data that appeared on the screen, but did not comment on anything. He continued to explain. This time, in addition to the inspection of Mr. Shan Chuan's state, we also need to confirm your state. Huaishir was amused and shook his head. I didn't promise to join the old people's Sunset Red Club. 008 was strangely silent for a moment, and even the rigid electronic voice showed a trace of sympathy and pity. Mr. Russell signed for you. Fuck, Huaishir subconsciously cursed. He should have thought of it. That old bastard had been quiet for so long. How could he let his tool be idle at home and not make any arrangements? But it's okay to sell students at ordinary times. This time, he actually sold himself to the Continuation Academy. This is F** king off the list. Of course, you still have the right to refuse. 008 put his hands aside, waiting for Huaishir to figure out the cause and effect. After calming down again, he continued unhurriedly. But before that, I hope you can listen to me and finish the matter. Huaishir took a deep breath, restrained his impulse to smoke, turned the lighter in his hand, which had run out of oil several times, and pinched it in the palm of his hand. I'm all ears, he said. You will participate in a struggle. You may face an unsolvable dead end. As a tool, as a chess piece, you may be required to give up your life in the end. 008 told the truth. I don't deny the danger. After all, this action is also a big gamble for the Continuation Academy. But the greater the risk, the greater the gain, isn't it? Huaishir was unmoved. Danger, death, sacrifice. I have been a veteran tool and chess piece for so long that I have long been used to it. But what's the price, Mr. 008? He looked at 008 and asked solemnly, You don't seem to have ever said what I can get. Of course, you won't return empty-handed, Mr. Huaishir. Like a machine without any negotiation skills, 008 straightforwardly opened the price. Apart from what Mr. Russell has got, if you can return successfully, in addition to the upgrade and transformation of the Nemo engine, the liquefaction essence needed by the Nautilus will be provided by the Continuation Academy. After a pause, he added, "What we provide is not the most basic liquefaction essence, but the pure soul after the sixth layer of qualitative change." Fleischer froze in place. Well, the original astronomical figure is now 10 times higher. 10 times the astronomical figure is still an astronomical figure. It just makes him a little unbelievable. Such a big number? Are you sure? He asked. It's just the energy that can be obtained by extracting the soul. There's no difference between sublimation and solidification. 008 replied. We have enough bases in hell to specialize in the production of this energy to supply the consumption of the Continuation Academy itself. In fact, all of the Origin Substance supplements made from Origin Substance, including the ones distributed by the Bureau of Governance, are all provided by us. If the significance of the Directorate is to connect and control everything, then the special attributes of the Continuation Academy are destined to be independent and closed. Even if it is in the present realm, it is still independent of the present realm. Finances, output, demand. In all aspects, it is self-sufficient and does not rely on the support of the Directorate. Even if the whole present realm is destroyed tomorrow, the Continuation Academy can still persist to the theoretical period set when it was originally designed. Fleischer did not doubt 008's words. In fact, he was already tempted. Do you want to get involved? After all, the upgrade and transformation of the Nemo engine are also good. Next, the price offered by 008 made him hesitate no more. In addition, we will provide you with a clue, 008 said, about the dead sun. Chapter 1103. The Dead Sun. Fleischer's movements were stiff for a long time, and he did not speak. The required items were sun's remains, eternal fire, seed of the abyss. The required condition was darkness of the realms. The required ritual was ignite hell, burn everything. In the end, he would be reborn from the boundless fire and light. This was the advancement required by East Lord, the peak of heaven's inquisition. In this regard, Tangi had already made a detailed explanation. Among them, sun's remains referred to the divine crystal left by the former sun god. Eternal fire was the source of eternal light from the scorching sun. Seed of the abyss was the essence and power from the ruler, and darkness of the realms, as the name implied, was the moment when the border of the present realm and hell lost their light. In the end, he ignited the entire hell and burned everything, including himself. From the collapsed hell, he would become a new sun that rose and shone with endless light. He would become East Lord. It should be said that this was an advancement that belonged to Fleischer alone, and it was more than one level higher than the requirements required for East Lord's advancement. Moreover, this was only a part of it. Among the names listed in the long list, none of them were easy to deal with. Sun's remains required him to find the divine crystal left behind by a sun god before he fell. But the problem was that most of the sun gods, as long as they had a name, were killed by someone who passed by many years ago, and not even a handful of ashes were left. The rest fell into the rancher's stomach. If he wanted to dig it out, he had to jump into the mouth of the destruction elemental and find it himself. Eternal fire. S requirement was the most general. It required Fleischer to find an inextinguishable fire, an untainted light. Seed of the abyss, on the other hand, required Fleischer to kill at least one ruler with matching attributes. Then he had to dig out their solidified souls and authority from their corpses and make them into his own advancement materials before drying them. The most torturous thing was the prerequisite, darkness of the realms. As everyone knew, the sun was the projection of the pillar of the divine essence in the universe. If they wanted to plunge the entire reality, the border, and even hell into darkness, they would have to ask Fleischer to turn off this light. But this thing was not a switch placed next to the door where anyone could just go and press it. Even if Fleischer managed to find the switch, Who knew what kind of chaos it would cause the moment the spirit's essence pillar went offline? That was the foundation of the three great seals. Unless Huaishur had made up his mind to become a traitor in the dark, he would never consider it. One could only say that there was still a long way to go. The moment he received the list, Huaishur almost wanted to delete his account and stop playing. Fortunately, the most illusory requirement had been met by him first, the eternal, inextinguishable flame, which referred to the eternal light. The flame had never been the focus. On the contrary, the light created by the fire was its essence. And Huaishur happened to have a set of Helios's miracle in his hands, as well as the Ascension mystic instrument created by the Grand Master Publius. It pointed to his good brother, the Light King, Baldur, who was still at his beck and call even though he was already dead. At that time, Huaishur would be the Light King's mortal incarnation, holding his authority in his hands. The eternal light was not a problem at all. If the Continuation Academy could help solve the sun's remnant, then it was not impossible for him to work hard to fulfill the seed of the abyss. Anyway, couldn't he just call for help if he couldn't win? Recently, there was still the War of the Realms. Although it was not easy to find a ruler, it was better than finding a needle in a haystack in the vast abyss. As for the darkness of the realms, he could only hope that Tangi's estimation was correct. As everyone knew, for the Astronomy Society, destroying a world was as easy as eating and drinking. After every major adjustment and turmoil, such as the War of the Realms, the Astronomy Society would spend a huge amount of correction points to reconstruct the present realm. After the old world was disintegrated, the present realm would be reconstructed on this foundation, reinstalling the sea disk, or rather, replacing it with a new one. The 15th World Destruction Plan and the World Creation Plan should already be in the process of preparation. At that time, the three great seals would definitely be temporarily closed, and the spirit marrow, origin substance, and pillar of change would also be offline. Huaishur might be able to hitch a ride and find an opportunity to advance. If that was the case, Huaishur might not have a headache. After all, as long as there was a path, he could just take it. Bumps and bumpy roads were better than no roads at all. But the key was that he had to take more than one path. At the same time, he needed to prepare for and accept the advancement at the same time. Not only did Yin Zhongjuan need to advance, but Great Siming also needed to advance at the same time. Otherwise, he would not be able to achieve the embryonic form of Tai. In fact, he might even be devoured by his own deluxe version of Dong Jun's advancement. In the original deduction and calculation, the key reason why everyone who advanced to Dong Jun would become an artificial sun without any consciousness was that no matter how firm and tenacious a human soul and will were, they could not withstand such a violent and huge divine power. The miracle was too huge, and it would crush the soul of the Ascendant. Now, Tangi still dared to add more without any scruples. Other than letting Huaishur take the deluxe version of the advancement at the beginning, her biggest assurance came from the other sacred mark, Changshi, which was originally designed to assist Dong Jun and prevent him from going out of control. Changshi was named after the moon goddess. Compared to Dong Jun's tyranny, Changshi was the embodiment of mercy and peace. But in fact, just like the light of the moon was also reflected from the sun, these two sacred marks were two sides of the same coin. Changshi, an outsider that did not exist in Jyoga, was a control mechanism that Tangi specially added in the road of Heaven's Inquisition after countless failures. It was a buffer layer that was tailor-made for Dong Jun. Its essence was the combination of the divinity of Shi-He, who was known as the Sun Protector, and Chang-Yi, who was known as the Moon Mother. In the end, it formed a protection that was enough to protect the soul and will of the Ascendant from being burned by the sun. Otherwise, once the advancement began, Huaishur would probably become the fuel of the sun, and he would not be able to achieve Dong Jun. In order to form the embryonic form of Tai, Tangi added more water to the noodles and water to the noodles. She was unwilling to reduce the ingredients, which directly led to the difficulty of Huaishur's advancement from nightmare level to nightmare level. Fortunately, she also knew that she could not get over her conscience and promised that Huaishir would not have to worry about Changshi's advancement. She would take care of it herself. Otherwise, he would probably only feel despair. And now, the Continuation Academy happened to place such a clue as the dead sun in front of Huaishir, which had already given him an irresistible reason. But, can I ask something? He raised his hand curiously. Excuse me, who is the dead sun referring to? After all, as far as I know, the death of the sun god of the present realm is more, well, thorough. It's normal to be suspicious. After all, even the Continuation Academy can't determine its state now, 008 replied. The clue we have is the whereabouts of the sun god of the Indian lineage, Surya, Tisk. Huaishir seemed to hear a certain someone's displeased voice. He pretended not to hear and continued to listen to 008. Hundreds of years ago, before the gods chose to unite, what was going on for a long time was a war of unity and authority. Many gods fell as a result. Among them, the most tragic fall was in the realm of the sun. Although Surya was not spared, due to Brahma's reminder, before he fell, he transferred his divinity and authority to another place in advance to prepare for his resurrection. However, the plan did not catch up with the changes. Due to the birth of the rancher, Surya's resurrection ritual was affected and interfered with. It was destined to fail, but it was not a complete failure. If I have to say, after the separation of consciousness, the sun god is now in a state of neither life nor death, 008 reminded him. If you want to find the remains of the sun, this will be your best chance. Other than that, I'm afraid there's only a pile of leftovers left to choose from in the whole realm. That dog, I said. I'm so pissed off. Those Indians are the same as their gods. None of them keep their words and do things reliably. They have 100,000 ways to run away and slack off. Huaishir could only pretend not to hear the resentful whispers of a certain black-hearted woman. After thinking for a moment, he could not help but ask, why do I feel that the Continuation Academy seems to want me to participate? Indeed, this will be the first step in our formal cooperation, won't it? 008 did not hide, nor was he afraid that Huaishir would take the opportunity to raise the price. In addition, regarding your advancement, we will provide all the help we can in the future. However, now it seems that other things may not need to worry too much about unpopular characters like us. To be honest, this is a bit overpriced. Huaishir rubbed his face and said helplessly, as a tool, I still know what I'm capable of. You guys have come up with so many things, I'm a little scared, you understand? In terms of investment, some of us have already felt that such a strategy is too conservative. 008 was silent for a moment, and a trace of melancholy seemed to emerge in his dry electronic voice. Sir Huaishir, we are eager to witness the birth of a East King. After all, celestial genealogy is not the only one in this world who yearns for the return of the utopia. Even if the behemoth of the past cannot return to its former height in a short period of time, this is not the reason why it must be missing. The absence of one of the three pillars is not a good thing for the astronomical society or for the present state. With that, 008 handed a gray invitation letter to Huaishir. We will look forward to your reply. In this regard, Huaishir could only be silent. In the end, before leaving, 008 asked again, do you have any other questions? To be honest, there are a lot. Huaishir shrugged. When to leave, when to come back, about what to do. You have to tell me something I can know, right? 008 raised his hand and took out a thin book from the briefcase again. This is an answer book specially prepared for you. It includes our schedule, the parts you need to be responsible for, and so on. This is really... Huaishir's eyes twitched, and he could only say, well prepared. This is the style of the Continuing Academy. 008 replied indifferently. Besides that, is there anything else? Huaishir thought for a moment and finally asked, there is another question that has nothing to do with me. Please speak. Shangazumi, why did he agree to participate? Huaishir asked, what did you promise? 008 seemed to be silent for a second, but it was so short that people couldn't tell. In the end, he replied, we promised him a position in the plan, that's all. His purpose is the process itself. The messenger of the continuing academy said, in the last stage of his life, Mr. Shangazumi wants a battle. A battle that can make him commit himself wholeheartedly like a swordsman and generously die. He wants a death that is worthy of the identity of the Sword Saint. In this way, the final answer was made. 008 took a step back and took a last look at Huaishur and the air behind Huaishur. He nodded slightly, as if saying goodbye. He turned and left. Soon, the figure carrying the briefcase disappeared behind the open door. Chapter 1104. It was the same as an illusion. Huaishur actually saw a trace of fatigue, like the gray-robed man from 008's back. Don't think about it. It's not the same person, although that guy isn't much better. Tangi emerged from the air, looking unhappy. After all, it's the dean. What the hell? Huaishur's legs went soft, and he almost sat on the ground. He looked back and forth in disbelief at the direction where Tangi and the figure left. Him? The dean? Should I say the dean, or the remnants of the dean? It's hard to say. Tangi took out a washed apple from her pocket and took 2 bites. The Continuation Institute is so mysterious. Even the dean is the same. Internal changes are never announced to the public, and internal results are never released to the public. Similarly, internal deaths are never known to the outside world. After implementing mysticism to the end, even the Continuation Institute itself doesn't know how many secrets it has, including who the hell is the dean. They don't even know who the dean is. Huaishur was puzzled. This was getting more and more ridiculous. If you're the boss, and you're always covered by a chemical suit and a gas mask, how many subordinates do you think will recognize you? Regardless, the one who is recognized by the Continuation Court is the dean himself. Do you think the Continuation Academy will call me dean? It can't talk. Tangi shook her head and replied indifferently. But I'm afraid it can do everything except talk, right? No, maybe it can really talk. After all, the artificial intelligence that communicates with the outside world has never said where it comes from. The Continuation Institute is alive. Huaishur was not referring to the organization and structure they formed, but the building itself. How could the existence that can block so many pollutants and distortion values be just 2 simple walls? It has its own will and will choose agents for itself. And the unlucky ones who are chosen will be tortured forever when they are alive, and will contribute their remaining heat when they die, without any peace. What you saw just now was the dean it chose. Perhaps it was a candidate, or perhaps it was a remnant of the previous dean. No matter what, that number is quite close to the front. She paused for a moment before concluding, the Continuation Academy values you, Huaishur, be it the organization or itself. But that is to be expected, since those who could not see your potential and ability are either idiots or blind. Ahaha, it's a little embarrassing for you to praise me like that. Huaishur scratched his head shyly. I'm just praising the tool. What are you so proud of? Tongji rolled her eyes. In short, be prepared to be entangled with them in the future. Who knows what those guys are up to? Don't think that they're kind people. For those guys who only care about results, if you're useful enough, they'll even stuff the elemental of destruction into your stomach and lock you up like a prison. Huaishur froze for a long time. Now, it shouldn't be that bad, right? Don't worry, it shouldn't be that bad in the future unless there's really no other way. Tongji said calmly. To them, a disposable tool or a permanent ATM, it's still clear which is more valuable. After all, once Russell succeeds in restoring the Utopia, you'll definitely be the next master of the pedigree and the future king of the Utopia. In a few decades, after that old bastard kicks the bucket, you might also be able to elect the next president. It's such a distant matter. Don't give me a shot of adrenaline, okay? Besides, Russell is only a little over 100 years old, and you're already calling him old. For some reason, Huaishur's movements suddenly stiffened. He tried hard to restrain the urge to twitch his face, and then abruptly changed the topic. So should I go or not? Go. There's good stuff to get, so why not? Tangi glanced at him with a smile, as if she knew what he was going to say next, which made Huaishur's hair stand on end. Ahem, well, I feel that it'll be very dangerous. He tried hard to ignore the premonition of death that was close at hand and continued to ask, "Look, after all, the Continuation Institute also said that it's very dangerous, right? If we don't come back, won't we be used as a private vehicle and suffer a tragic loss?" "Oh, scared?" Tongi laughed. Scared. Huaisher nodded frantically, not knowing what she was referring to. "In short, very scared. It's natural to be scared, but don't worry." Tongi shook her head. When the Continuation Institute said that it's dangerous, it means that they're only 80% sure, so they're a little panicked. It's like a top student telling you that it's very difficult after the exam, but you can't do it anymore. There's definitely danger, but those guys are like the gods in some cheap novels. They never give experimental subjects tasks that exceed their abilities. So, as long as you work hard, there won't be any major problems. Hearing what she said and seeing that her expression was normal, Huaisher was relieved. However, after taking 2 steps, he remembered his discovery and couldn't help but be curious. "Tongi, were you angry at that time?" "No." Tongi smiled and waved her hand. "Don't worry, I won't be angry behind your back or anything." "Ahem, I mean the sun god," Huaisher asked tentatively. "Because of Celia?" "No." Tongi shook her head. "That's good." Huaisher nodded and comforted her. "Think on the bright side. If you didn't fail back then, wouldn't I be useless now?" "Right, I wouldn't." Tongi didn't say anything else. She looked at Huaisher in silence for a long time and told him word by word, "I didn't." "Okay, I got it. You didn't." Huaisher nodded hard. Obviously super. 2 days later, in the Foundry Center, Huaisher repeatedly confirmed that the assembly line was set up correctly and that there were no mistakes in the process. After confirming that the group of interns under his command had indeed figured out how to produce, he finally let out a sigh of relief. The process of creating alchemy was inseparable from the maintenance and care of alchemists, but the art of forging was much more convenient. The main thing was that there was a sufficient supply of origin substance and appropriate maintenance. Even if Huaisher left, it wouldn't affect the operation of the assembly line. After all, they were all relatively low-end products, so there was no need to put in much effort and process. He had already thrown all the work that belonged to him to Yuan as usual. He also didn't need to worry about the training hall. With the heir appointed by the Sword Saint presiding over things, the little cabin in the forest assisting from the side, and a professional badass like Hades, even if things didn't go well, it wouldn't be too bad. Huaisher only needed to use the name of Celestial Genealogy to support his students, and everything would be fine. As for Anna, she seemed to be frightened by the big sisters outside. In the past 2 days, she was very well behaved and didn't even cause any trouble. She even ate less. Huaisher could only leave a lot of homework as a comfort, hoping that she would get over the pain soon. After dealing with all the other matters without stopping, Huaisher sat at the table in the Stone Marrow Hall and looked at the thick book that the Continuation Academy had left for her. She also looked at the invitation letter in front of her. He hesitated. According to the Continuation Institute, if he was willing to accept the invitation, as long as he opened the invitation when he was ready to leave, they would receive the news. But just as Huaisher was about to open the invitation, he heard a knock on the door. The courier from yesterday's delivery waited with a smile. Every time it was this person, it always made Huaisher wonder if there were no other salespeople in their company. "Please sign for it, Mr. Huaisher. It's right here." The courier pointed to the blank space in the document. After confirming that Huaisher had received goods, he left without any sense of presence, leaving Huaisher and the cardboard box in front of him. It felt like there was a problem, especially when he saw the sender's name was Russell. The box was wrapped in layers, just like Russell's own bad taste. After 6 layers of dolls, there was only a small box left in his hand, which seemed to be able to hold a diamond ring. Huaisher couldn't help but feel a little scared. What if this old thing awakened some terrible hobby? Should he put righteousness before family? Or should he put righteousness before family? It was really hard to choose. When he reluctantly opened it, he found that there was only a glass bead the size of a thumb inside. It was translucent and made of crystal, but the rough surface and the uncorrected edges and corners revealed the maker's carelessness and perfunctory work. What the hell is this? Fleischer picked it up and looked at it carefully. But in a trance, the thing in his hand disappeared without a trace. He couldn't see it anymore. It was like a bubble that evaporated in the sun. But when he looked up and looked around, he spontaneously felt a sense of fluttering and confusion, as if everything had changed subtly. But soon, this strange feeling disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until Fleischer rummaged through a pile of cardboard boxes for a long time that he realized that he had been fooled by Russell again. In desperation, he could only call and ask in person, "What did you send me?" Through the receiver, he could hear the faint melody of a record on the other end of the phone, as well as Russell's low humming, pleasant and relaxed. As if thinking for a moment, he replied, "Well, just treat it as a lie." "A lie?" Fleischer frowned. "Yes, a lie from Loki. As for the content of the lie, keep it a secret for the time being. Anyway, it's just a preparatory measure. Just forget about it." Russell replied calmly, "Compared to this, shouldn't you be setting off, Fleischer? Don't let others wait too long. Don't let you miss out on fun." Fleischer rolled his eyes and hung up the phone. He didn't want to pay attention to this mysterious guy anymore. He tore up the invitation in his hand without hesitation. There was no door in the void. Neither did the earth shake or the mountains shake. In the blink of an eye, the world in front of him had changed drastically. The lush forest, the tall tower that reached into the sky, and even the familiar campus scene disappeared without a trace. Instead, it was replaced by a grayish-black enclosed space. Lights hung above the low dome, thick pillars, grayish-black ground, and a dark space that seemed to extend to the end of the world. And the most important thing was in front of him, the noble girl with a smile, her crimson dress fluttering in the air like blood. Finally, in her hand, there was a stone sword that was slashing straight at his head. "Hello, Fleischer," Liz Heckermott greeted him. Chapter 1105. At that time, the sword was only 0.01 centimeters away from his forehead. But Fleischer knew that in the next second, the sword would hit nothing, because without thinking, he rolled and slid on the ground, instantly retreating a distance of more than a dozen steps. When he looked back, he sighed, "Do you Americans always greet each other in such a ridiculous way?" "Yes." Liz dragged the stone sword and moved forward. The dark red stone pieces rubbed against the ground, bursting into dazzling sparks. "This is a welcome ceremony specially prepared for you, Fleischer." "Wow, that's such an honor." Fleischer was so moved that he couldn't help but clap his hands. "I thought Americans greet people with cannons." "Little Liz, are you so gentle?" Liz's movements paused for a moment, and the coldness above her eyes burst out like a cold wave. Just like when she beat up her cheap uncle, she gritted her teeth and could no longer restrain her anger. In an instant, she broke through the air. "Don't call me Little Liz." It was difficult to tell which of the 3 slashes came first or at the same time. The iron light crisscrossed. Fleischer wanted to dodge and retreat, but when he looked back, he found that after the iron light in front of him left the sword blade, it formed a solid outline. It was as agile as a living thing and flew towards Fleischer on its own. It even cooperated with Liz's sword blade to block all escape routes for Fleischer, forcing him to face it head-on. He had no choice but to pull out the sword of virtue. Block. Sparks flew. Fleischer was stunned. "Wow, are you serious? What makes you think that after you sold me a bunch of junk, I should greet you with a smile, Fleischer?" Liz took a step forward and resisted Fleischer's power. She looked down and said, "If you ask me, using a stone sword instead of a divine mark to greet you is already the best way to restrain yourself." Cough, cough. Everything can be discussed. Fleischer blinked innocently. "Well, everyone knows that goods are naturally divided into different specifications. If you're not satisfied with the basic model, you can always pay for the upgraded version. At most, I'll give you a year's worth of furnace repair service for free. Okay? By the way, if you join the free upgrade program now, you can exchange the old model for the next generation of Foundry for a little bit of money. Don't you Americans like this?" Speaking of that, he was no longer sleepy. He excitedly introduced, "Thanks to your sales strategy, we are now developing a cloud foundry center. Customers can submit their foundry blueprints to the large server that has just been built on the darknet for optimization and storage. Furthermore, they can also join our sharing plan. They can connect their foundry to the cloud, and all the foundry in the world will be divided into a part of the matrix to deal with the problem of large-scale border relics, benefiting the world. Oh, and if you join now, you can even get virtual coins that are priceless by participating in the forging process. After hearing that, Liz could not help but laugh. Do I look like a fool who would pay for your work for free? You have to pay enough money first. I admit that I earn a little, but I can't be a mistress. Look at how generous the Eastern Xia Kingdom is. How can you monopolize it? That's right, Zhang Wuji said. Huaisha retorted. Besides, everyone is for me, and I am for everyone. One for all. How can you call me a fool? Then I'll ask you to make a sacrifice first. Liz sneered. In the stone sword, the phantom of the jaguar roared silently, bursting out a high-pitched sword cry. With your broken body, I offer it to the gods. The earth cracked, and endless blood spurted out from the cracks, falling down into the bottomless abyss below like a waterfall. This place had become a cruel altar in front of the gods. Now, holding the stone sword, the high priestess raised her eyes and looked at the sacrifice in front of her. There was nowhere to hide and no way to escape. This time, I won't let you escape, bastard, she whispered coldly. No matter what tricks you use, it won't work. It was an obsession that had lasted since they met in the Village of Dusk. Hidden under their alliance, hidden under each other's understanding and recognition, was a determination that was deeper and even greater than that. Today, between you and me, we must decide who is better. Well, is it too late for me to surrender now? Huaisha raised his hand subconsciously and begged without hesitation. As long as you don't hit my face, you can have anything you want. You can even post an apology on Weibo. I'll write you 3,000 words, okay? It's not like we can't discuss the number of words. That kind of thing can wait until I offer your mouth to the corn god. Liz stepped forward indifferently. Don't worry, I'll let you live. Or, if you beat me, won't the problem be solved too? Seriously, why are you being so calculative with a music teacher? Huaisha scratched his head helplessly and sighed. Thinking back, I was beaten up by you every time. Last time in the Village of Dusk, didn't you also make a hole in me? Is winning or losing that important? Friendship comes first, competition comes second. Besides, we even danced. Before he finished speaking, he felt that he had poked a hole in the ground. No, it should be said that he had picked up the pot that should not have been picked up. Once again, Liz recalled the humiliating memories of being teased again, and her face became more and more ugly. Think about it carefully, don't let me live. She squeezed the words out from between her teeth. A bastard like you should just die. The spirit of left hummingbird rose from the endless blood and looked down at everything on the blood-stained altar with a hideous smile, waiting for the sacrifice to be made. This Huaisha was stunned. He did not mind moving his body occasionally. Besides, who would not like to fight with a girl? However, he had just advanced not long ago, and he did not have time to get used to Yin Zhongjuan's strength. If he was not careful, wouldn't it be a major disaster? Or should he just grit his teeth and let her beat him up? Anyway, she would not kill him, right? But what if he was really beaten to death? How could he not tell that Liz had probably advanced a long time ago and was trying her best to get back at him? Just as his mind was wandering, Liz, who was getting more and more gloomy, could no longer tolerate the frivolity and arrogance of her opponent. The stone sword slashed down again, and when it slashed down from the air, it made a high-pitched sound as if it was rubbing against steel. Under the crack, the color of blood swirled and rose to the gloomy ceiling. The sharp blade was already inches away from Huaisha's eyes. In the end, it stopped abruptly in front of two thick fingers. Phew, that was close. The old man who came late sighed softly. We almost had a diplomatic accident. The palm, which was as rough as tree bark, was full of wrinkles left by time. The skeleton, which should have shrunk after the flesh and blood died, had become terrifyingly huge. Just that hand alone was enough to cover Huai Shi's head and crush his dog's head. But now it was blocking his way. Between the two of them, a thin and stooped figure suddenly appeared, holding a curved iron staff in his hand. His broad bones supported his body like an old mountain range. The stone sword stopped abruptly. When the old man's left hand knocked on the iron staff, the crisp sound made the blood and the crack on the ground disappear without a trace. How disappointing, Liz. The old man with the feathered crown looked at his junior and couldn't help but shake his head and scold. I thought you sneaked out because you've finally grown up and want to find someone to confess to. But in the end, you're fighting. You're representing the American lineage, representing the inheritance of noble blood. Look, is this appropriate? Is this reasonable? The helplessness of being exasperated at his failure to live up to his expectations was simply overflowing with words. After a brief moment of astonishment, Liz could not help but squint at him. There was no respect. She suddenly asked, "How much did you bet with him?" "Of course, I bet all in. What's the point of a small fight? How could our Liz fight?" The old man proudly raised his head and answered without hesitation. After noticing Liz's strange expression, he suddenly coughed twice. "Ahem, it doesn't matter how much you bet. What's important is that I think highly of you. Then I'll have to thank you." As if she had long been accustomed to the unreliability of her family's elders, Liz did not even have the interest to be angry. She just pulled out the stone sword from his hand. At this point, even if she wanted to hurry up and fight with Huai Shi, with this old man here, she was afraid that she could not fight anymore. After leaving an angry look that said, "Be careful next time," she did not talk nonsense and turned to leave. And the old man finally turned his head back with a smile. Because his old and stooped body was so huge, even if he was half-bent, his huge shadow still covered Huai Shi's face, bringing a mountain-like pressure. Huai Shi suppressed the urge to suck in a breath of cold air and squeezed out a smile. How are you, old man?" It would be fine if he did not realize it at the beginning, but if he still could not recognize it now, he did not want to live anymore. The crown person of the American lineage was now an important assistant of the feathered serpent and the inner elder of the American lineage, the world's giant, Teralt Cutley. "How is it, kid? You heard what I said just now, right?" Teralt's old face suddenly grinned. He moved closer and revealed an expectant expression. "Kid, there are very few people in the whole realm with conditions like our Liz. Do you want to consider it?" Huai Shi's expression twitched. He subconsciously leaned back and wanted to remind Teralt, "The one you're talking about is not far away." There was only a roar that broke through the air. A stone-toothed sword flew over from the distant darkness and mercilessly slashed the old man's head. Sparks flew and almost fell on Huai Shi's face. Teralt reached out his hand indifferently and pulled out the stone-toothed sword that was wedged into the feathered crown. He glanced at him with a smile and turned back to encourage him before leaving. "Think about it carefully. I have high hopes for you." "Pa!" The second spear, engraved with tiger stripes, pierced his old face. After a spark jumped, he casually caught it in his hand. Why do young people nowadays like to fight so easily? Love and peace are the true meaning. Just like that, he sighed and knocked the iron staff down. Just like that, the old man disappeared on the spot without any warning. Only Huai Shi was left alone in the empty and strange hall. When he looked around, he saw nutshells, melon seed skins, and popcorn shards all over the floor. His eyes could not help but twitch wildly. How many people were watching the live broadcast here just now? Just as he was scratching his head, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "It's time to go, Huai Shi." When Huai Shi turned around, he saw the man standing there. His expression seemed to be eternally serious. His tie and cuffs were meticulous, and there was not a single wrinkle on his grayish-black robe. The lines were so smooth that it moved one to tears. The ivory tower was always reliable, the pillar of celestial genealogy, the last conscience of utopia. "Vice Principal." Huai Shi was stunned. "When did you arrive?" "Just now." Isaac was silent for a few seconds, and his gaze drifted a little. "You were definitely here from the beginning. Let's not talk about these unimportant things. Follow me." Isaac took the initiative to walk in front. making Huaishi's heart turn cold. He's actually changing the topic. However, after this incident, there was nothing much to say. It was all an old score he had left behind in the past. How could he blame him for blocking the door? He followed behind the vice principal and stepped into a door that suddenly opened. However, behind the door was a narrow walkway, and beyond it was a cliff that was 10,000 feet high. In the deep darkness in the distance, there seemed to be a low roar. Countless huge modules descended or rose under the pull of chains and mechanisms, stirring up a cold wind. After passing through another door, they seemed to have come to a lawn under the sun. However, the sun seemed to have no temperature, and the scenery in the distance was too fleeting. It was like a bubble. "Where are we?" Huaisher asked. "The Continuation Institute." Isaac looked back at him and added, "It's not the peripheral institution you've been to, but the real headquarters of the Continuation Institute." He pushed open the door and walked into the spacious hall. It was like an afternoon tea party. Under the lazy and illusory sunlight, two ladies at a low table were talking about something. Sensing that they had walked in, they looked over at the same time. The one in front was about middle-aged. Her skin was slightly tanned, and there was a little red makeup on her forehead. There was no sign of gentleness in her demeanor, but her pair of golden eyes made people feel a sense of desolation and uneasiness. In her arms, she was holding a little monkey that was eating peanuts. It was raising its paw, trying to pull its master's golden hair ornament. "Don't be rude," Isaac reminded in a low voice. "That's Nanin's mother of India's destruction lineage. In her arms is the living miracle, Hanuman." "Don't say it like I'm a grumpy old lady, Isaac." Nanin's mother shook her head slightly. She glanced at Huaisher and nodded as if she was praising him. Beside her, the old lady who didn't hide her age couldn't help but laugh. "It's rare to see you so reserved, Huaisher." The old man with short silver hair asked jokingly, "What's wrong? You don't even greet me when you see me?" When Huaisher finally looked over, he didn't dare to speak. He no longer cared about the demeanor of a navigator and the bearing of the disaster sword. He quickly lowered his head and saluted respectfully. "Emperor Qing." Chapter 1106. Huaisher, you still look like you can't straighten your back after taking advantage of me. The old lady didn't seem to care about Huaisher's politeness and awe. Instead, she shook her head and said, "If you don't have a thick skin, it will be difficult for you to achieve anything in the future. Whether I have a thick skin or not has nothing to do with whether I respect others or not." Huaisher replied indifferently, "I'm just grateful for your help." "Ha ha, you're still so good at talking. You make me feel happy. I'll take it that you like to cast a long line to catch a big fish." Emperor Qing smiled happily, no longer showing his usual arrogant and indifferent look. Instead, he pointed to the seat next to him and said, "Since you've come at the right time, would you like to chat with this old woman for a while?" Huaisher was about to decline when Isaac took the initiative to say, "Sorry, I have something else to discuss with Huaisher. Next time, then." The old lady waved her hand heartily. "I won't force you to participate in the afternoon tea party of us old people." The two old seniors were very gentle and didn't have the idea of showing off their master's demeanor to the young people. However, the monkey took advantage of Huaisher's inattention to pull his hair and went back while squeaking. It was very proud. With his mother beside him, Huaisher didn't dare to pick up the damn monkey and beat it up. He could only nod politely and say goodbye. After going upstairs and sitting down in Isaac's suite, the vice president brought over a glass of wine. After sitting down and pondering for a moment, he asked, "Did the president say anything to you before you came?" "It's as good as not saying anything." Huaisher shrugged and asked, "So, can you tell me first? What's the matter? Where are the enemies? How many should I kill?" "I don't know." Isaac shook his head. After taking a sip of whiskey, he sighed with some worry and said, "I'm afraid the Continuation Institute will have a lot to do. Don't you have any tips?" Huaisher curiously leaned forward from the sofa and winked at him. She was just short of saying, "Hurry up and take a look at the future, then come back and give me a spoiler" on her face. Isaac was silent for a long time, perfectly concealing the awkwardness of being targeted. "There's too much noise on the timeline. I'm afraid the Continuation Academy won't give others such a chance. Everyone said that every edition was a god, but there were not many who were targeted like him in every edition. Take a bug like Kronos, for example. Everyone would take a stab at him when they had nothing to do. But after so many years, he was still a bug, and the only thing missing was to write a ban on his face. It couldn't be helped. As long as it was a one-on-one battle, the vice principal would always be a god. Strong crowd control and strong output. If he couldn't win, he would even block. The other side had no chance at all. If it was a group battle, then everyone would have to think of a way to ban the character. Otherwise, there would be no gaming experience at all. There was no surprise that the Continuation Academy would make the first move. What they had here, there would definitely be something in hell as well. If things turned into two-time manipulators playing with each other, then it would only become an endless loop without any value, and it wouldn't benefit the outcome. But even so, the vice principal still came here as a representative of celestial genealogy, which meant that he still had value in other aspects. Putting aside the role of a sublimator as a tool, a person like him, who was a top scholar in over 40 subjects, would always be an indispensable part of the decision-making process. I'm afraid you won't directly participate in this battle, right? Huaisher asked. It's hard to say. The mysticism of the Continuation Academy is always unpredictable. Isaac rubbed his eyes tiredly. It was obvious that he had inquired about and come into contact with such matters these days. It was a pity that he didn't have Russell's ability to wield influence, and there was nothing he could do about the deep-rooted secrecy system of the Continuation Academy. Huaisher shook his head and leaned on the sofa. They didn't even let me bring Nautilus. To be honest, I'm a little guilty. Think on the bright side. If the Continuation Academy doesn't let you bring it, it means they don't need it. The vice principal shook his head and raised his finger. Suddenly, several iron boxes were smashed next to Huaisher. Take these with you. He waved his hand, and the iron boxes opened, revealing the densely packed relics of the border. The sudden burst of light almost blinded Huaisher's eyes. Two gray gloves as thin as cicada's wings were the indestructible hand, a relic of the border from the ivory tower storage. It was claimed that as long as the other parts were not burned to ashes, it could even touch the core of a star. On both sides were the ring of longevity and the wings of blessing of death and decay. One of the two rings gave the wearer an additional 60% of vitality, regardless of the ratio, while the other was a miraculous treasure claimed to be able to defend against all curses and protect the soul. And in the middle of the ring was a huge 5-color diamond. Huaisher sucked in a cold breath. The legendary mark of miracle, Rainbow Eye, it remembered the wearer's best state. Once activated, it could directly backtrack the wearer to the save point 6 times. Below, it was an entire row of the most powerful single-soldier lethal weapons that the Directorate of Command's technical department had sealed off for Beelzebub, numbered curse bullets. There were 8 bullets with sequences above 3,000, 1 with sequences above 800, and 1 with sequences within the top 100. Just these few items added together were already the Ivory Tower's most prized possession, not to mention a full 1,000 milliliters of liquid source. It was enough for Huaisher to have enough power to bombard at full power for more than 10 minutes. Mr. Isaac, you didn't secretly move the school's secret storage, did you? Huaisher scratched his head. As the vice principal's secretary, he had never approved the withdrawal of these things. No, there were some things he had not even seen in the list. Isaac shook his head calmly. Don't worry. I only took what was within my authority. The rest are my personal and family collections. If you haven't used them all, remember to return them to me. This is a little too much, isn't it? Huaisher felt a little dizzy. It's just a precaution. Isaac was silent for a long time before telling him directly, I understand your style, but I hope you don't do too many unnecessary things, Mr. Huaisher. He paused and emphasized seriously. Also, listen to all instructions, understand? Huaisher was stunned. Maybe Mr. Russell has other considerations. I might have done something unnecessary. He looked down at the ice hockey on the table and sighed softly. But you have to understand, you're the future of celestial genealogy. You shouldn't be so careless. From the beginning, he had expressed his opposition to Huaishur participating in this plan. But just like in the past, his opposition would not work. When Kronos could not see the future that belonged to him clearly, the uneasiness hidden in his heart shook the 10,000-year-cold vice-chancellor. Was it really necessary to gamble so extravagantly? Could there really be so-called eternal victory at the gambling table? He did not know what Russell was thinking, but out of his trust in Russell, he did not question his judgment. Still, that did not stop him from doing what he could to prevent and remedy it. Protection for the future. Thank you, Mr. Isaac. I'll use them well. After a brief silence, Huaishur did not refuse Isaac's kindness and raised his hand to put them into the ultimate. Still, after several hesitations, he finally said, "If the future only exists in a greenhouse, that kind of overly fragile and delicate thing is not what everyone wants, is it?" Isaac said nothing, but outside the door, there was a teasing laugh. Things like the future have to be there first. But as long as there is, it won't be too bad. After the door was pushed open, a cheerful face poked out. So, apart from miracles, the legacy of the divine Marrow Road is only doting? Seeing the younger generation shining on the battlefield, Isaac's mother's heart would be drunk even if she did not say it. Perhaps she would be so moved that she would quietly wipe away her tears, right? The vice principal's expression froze and frowned slightly, but he did not get angry or scolded. Instead, he glanced helplessly at the newcomer and left his sight. He could not be bothered to argue. The first thing he saw was the tattoos that extended from beneath the leather jacket to her wrists and neck. Thorns, skulls, hearts, and profanities. Her pretty cheeks were smeared with smoky makeup, while her slender eyes and eyeliner were as sharp as knives. She swaggered in like a rider who had just returned from a motorcycle ride. After throwing her backpack on the table, she sat down beside Huaishur and patted him on the shoulder. She didn't hide her praise at all. "You did a good job on the return trip, kid. If you want to get rid of Russell in the future, I will definitely vote for you in the Academic Affairs office." Really? Huaishur was overjoyed. It was not clear whether he was happy to be praised or to hear that he had gotten rid of Russell and got a guarantee to get rid of him. "Madam Chun," Isaac sighed helplessly. As a teaching staff, at least set an example for the younger generation. Also, Mr. Russell is the principal after all. Can you pay more attention to this kind of topic? Okay, just kidding, but the voting is true. Madam Chun grinned and took out a wine pot from her pocket. "Do you want some?" A wisp of alcohol flowed out from the gap she opened. It did not have the sweetness of wine. Instead, it was pungent like fuel. With just a sniff, Huaishur felt as if his lungs were on fire. Even without the toxicity, something that could make Yin Zhongju and cough was definitely not something that humans could drink. Next to him, Madam Chun had already gulped down the bottle of liquid explosives. He did not know where the wine pot came from, but it was a relic from the border. The whole room was filled with the irritable and explosive smell, making it hard to breathe. Huaishur could only obediently serve alcohol and cigarettes to her senior in the midst of her shock. Speaking of which, this was the first time he had met this lady. Madam Chun. Her real name was unknown, and she had never said it before. It was said that she was born in a family, but because of her choice to abandon her family name, the only thing that was known was the login name in the internal system. As one of the people in charge of the Hell branch of the Ivory Tower, in terms of position, she was also one of the executive vice principals of the school. At the same time, she was also a Tier 4 sublimator of the Eternal Road. Unlike Raymond, who had just advanced to a worker with a blank set of equipment, she was the Judgment Scale Anubis, who had been equipped with a full set of godly equipment for many years. She was a destroyer with all her specialties in war. She was an out-and-out humanoid weapon, and could be said to be one of the strongest combat forces of the Ivory Tower in Hell. Relying only on herself, without any support or logistics, she had forcefully wiped out the entire Hell and opened up a branch base for the Ivory Tower. She had maintained it for so many years. The Hell creatures that were annihilated by her every year could not only meet the research and development needs of the Ivory Tower, but she also had the spare energy to sell them to the outside world. The amount of money generated was not only enough to meet the daily expenses of the branch, but also to save up all kinds of top equipment with astronomical figures. Encountering such a big shot, Huaisher only wanted to hug her thigh tightly and build a good relationship with her. When everyone was done drinking, they would go to hell together to kill a few rulers. At that time, everyone would split the harvest and help him accumulate the seed of the abyss. Wouldn't that be great? He really liked this big sister who could lead the team. After a round of drinking happily with Huaisher, Madame Chun seemed to have noticed Isaac, who was ignored by her. She looked around the room and asked, "It seems at this time, the three of us will team up and fight?" Russell really put in a lot of effort. Not only that, Isaac rubbed his forehead with a headache, sighed, and finally said truthfully, "Only the two of you are in charge of the battle. My main duty is to be responsible for listening to the command of Mr. Marcus." The former diplomat of the Republic, the uncle of the Roman Emperor, the old man who had been recuperating in the ivory tower for a long time. Compared to us guys who run errands, I'm afraid he's the real protagonist this time, right? At the same time, in the command bureau, accompanied by Jaeger, Russell finally saw his old friend again. He was in a wheelchair, dressed in a formal dress, and his white hair was meticulously tied up behind his head. As in previous years, he was gentle and elegant. However, after a long time, his face was already wrinkled and weathered. His eyes were turbid, as if he was distracted, staring blankly at the distant air. He didn't respond to the two visitors. "Mr. Marcus? Hello. May I ask if you still remember me? Did I take your linguistics class back then?" Jaeger greeted him for a long time, but he still didn't get a reply. In the end, he couldn't help but reach out and wave in front of his eyes. It only attracted a dull glance from the old man. Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth. Jaeger frowned and looked at 002, who wasn't far away. Since the Continuation Institute needs him, why don't they treat him? Mr. Marcus refused. 002 replied indifferently. A diplomat needs a clear mind and independent judgment. We can't take away one for the other. Besides, there is a problem that needs treatment. After examination, I don't think such a situation will hinder Mr. Marcus's performance. Okay. Jaeger restrained the urge to scratch his head, and his face was blank and dull. In other words, we have to place an unprecedented bet on an Alzheimer's patient who is about to forget who he is after getting old. He paused for a long time and sighed helplessly. To be honest, I'm a little lacking in confidence. Except for him, the Astronomy Society has no other choice. When the covenant was signed, he was the only one who still exists, and only he can represent the agreement between heaven and hell. Russell took out his handkerchief and wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth for his old friend. It doesn't matter who he is, as long as he still remembers what he has to do. He paused, bent down, squatted in front of his old friend, and asked solemnly, "My friend, can you do your duty?" In the wheelchair, the old man's eyes moved slightly and looked at him. It was as if he had just woken up from a dream. "Russell?" "Yes, it's me." Russell nodded. "Are you okay?" "Just a little." Marcus thought for a moment and shook his head. "Sleepy." "That's normal." Russell said, "Marcus, you're old and sleepy every day. From one dream to another. You can't tell whether you're awake or not." He asked softly, "But can you still defend the rights and interests of the present realm and ensure that the glory of the utopia doesn't fall?" At that moment, he saw the corners of the old man's mouth curl up slightly. It was as if he was happy. He glanced at him. Just like a long time ago, he was in high spirits. "Is the work about to start, Russell?" He murmured softly, as if he was talking in his sleep. "Yes, the heavy responsibility is in your hand again." Russell nodded. "Are you ready to face your enemy?" Thus, in the wheelchair, the dull old man once again revealed the heroic smile of the past. A mere diplomatic mission is nothing. Chapter 1107. The sky was shrouded in gray mist, and the smell of sulfur filled the hot wind. At the end of the sky, there were countless flashes of light falling from the sky. Those iron pieces that were soaked in the sediment of hell fell from the sky like meteors. The rain never stopped falling, falling into the cracked wasteland. Just like the endless sea that Xia defended, this was the deep manifestation of the Russian Federation that included countless borders, the Iron Rain wasteland. The boundless land that was once endless, enough for the mechanical border to roam freely, was now dyed red with pitch-black scorch marks and blood. When the defense line of the various worlds expanded and covered a total of 30 depths, this endless wasteland also expanded below the depths. It turned into a battlefield. Countless large groups, frozen beings, hell creatures, and even the palaces of rulers descended here, bringing war, destruction, and even the most insignificant killing. At the most dangerous time, even the fourth layer of defense was broken through and the edge of the reality was touched. And when it reversed, the mighty torrent once again flattened the tides of hell, pushing everything from the abyss back into the abyss. It was as if the endless war was here. In the endless sea, in the country of fog that covered the border of America, in the fiery domain of the Middle East, in the endless crypts under the endless depths of Rome, in the labyrinth of India, in the sky domain of Egypt, this was the real war of the worlds. The battle between the reality and hell, between humans and the abyss. And today, on this day, all the storms came to a strange stop. Just as everyone was uneasy and vigilant, countless large groups and legions from hell returned to their fortresses and palaces. Everything was calm, until the moment the gate of the reality opened. The abyss surged like a tide, and countless eyes were cast at the group of figures that descended on the wasteland. And the old man in a wheelchair, pushed by Russell, was at the front of the line. He lowered his head, holding the former contract in his hand. He was drowsy. Step by step, he approached the deepest part of hell, the domain shrouded in eternal lightning. It's been many years since I've seen such a spectacular scene. At the front of the border defense line, the white-haired feathered serpent was smoking a cigar as he said softly, "His mere arrival has caused all the kings to pay their respects, and even the abyss to open up a path. Even a master of the lineage can only be reduced to a foil." Beside him, Xian Yao nodded. In merely 100 years, he was able to establish such great achievements. How can such an existence not be revered? The feathered serpent was slightly dumbfounded and laughed. "I thought the Eastern Summer people would say that I can replace him. That's the theory, but it depends on the timing." Xin Yao replied indifferently. "The way of the world is unfair. Why don't you become a rebel and a traitor? You bet your 7 feet body and take the supreme merit of the universe. But if the world is peaceful, why bother to disturb Taiping for the sake of your own ambitions?" He thought for a moment and finally sighed. "The world is very good now." "That's right." The feathered serpent sighed. Even the master of the pedigree would sigh with emotion at the past glory of utopia and the present magnificence of the Astronomical Association when witnessing such a scene. No matter how open-minded they were, who wouldn't be envious? Ambitious people wouldn't reject power, and ascendants wouldn't reject miracles. Who could resist the temptation of controlling the world? Be it the feathered serpent, Xian Yao, or the Russian Federation's Pope, who had been silent from the beginning to the end, none of them hid their emotions. After so many years, everyone was so familiar with each other. There was no need to be secretive and be jealous together. To be able to become the masters of the pedigree, they had experienced countless hardships and established countless miracles. Their pioneering work, their ability, and talent were all witnessed by everyone. There is no falsehood in this. But why can't the person who established such a peerless achievement be me? However, although they were jealous, they would only be jealous for a moment. Indeed, the world was peaceful, and there was no place for heroes to use their martial arts. It was the most tragic. If it weren't for the chaotic situation and the precarious situation, why would there be heroes born from blood and tears? If the Astronomical Association collapsed, even if there was a chance to create another peerless achievement, what was the point of winning after sacrificing so much and losing so many fellow soldiers and companions? Just like that, under the gaze of the present realm and hell, the group slowly moved forward. Finally, they came to the front of the border, the boundary of the abyss. On one side of the border, 3 masters of the pedigree stood. On the other side, in the heavy darkness, several huge silhouettes slowly emerged, quietly waiting. The wheelchair came to the front of the border. The sleepy old man seemed to wake up. He raised his head and looked at the people behind him. "Thank you for your trouble." No one spoke. They just nodded silently, expressing their admiration and blessings. Work is about to start again. Just like that, Marcus sighed softly. He raised his skinny arms and pushed the wheelchair with all his might. He crossed the border and walked into hell. In the darkness, a skeletal face that looked like a huge goat's head slowly emerged. Pale flames burned in the eye sockets. He recognized the man in front of him. "Mr. Marcus, I've been waiting for a long time." The messenger from the Thunder Sea said, "The door of my master's palace has been opened for you. Then please give me a push." Marcus smiled and patted the wheelchair. "I can't walk anymore. It's my duty." The goat-headed messenger stretched out his withered claws and took over Russell's work. He pushed him and walked towards hell. Behind him, the huge silhouette in the darkness also moved. When the footsteps stepped down, there was a loud noise like a landslide. Just like that, it gradually went away. It was as if a special path was prepared for him. In just a short time, the endless scenes in the darkness changed. They crossed the barren mountains, the crimson river, the strange maze, and the countless manifestations of hell. They came under the endless dark clouds. Thunder coiled above the sky, like countless wings fluttering, swimming, and illuminating the towering city in front of them, and the long and narrow door towering into the clouds. Under the guards of the giants on the city wall, countless gazes looked down. They had already gone deep into hell and came before the ruler's royal carriage. What they saw along the way was a solemn scene. There was no noise in the empty palace. The tiny wheelchair and the messenger were as insignificant as dust in front of the building built by the giants. The messenger respectfully pushed the wheelchair forward until they reached the endless jade steps, in front of the palace flickering with lightning. "This one will send you here." The goat-headed messenger clasped his chest and withdrew. "My king is waiting in the hall." Just like that, he quietly retreated, leaving the white jade steps leading to the dark summit and the old man in the wheelchair. Marcus slowly raised his head until he reached his limit and once again saw the palace in his memory. After so many years, it was still so majestic and cruel. It never showed any mercy to the weak, but the strong decided the meaning of everything and the way of existence. The throne of the Thunder Sea Grand Monarch, the strongest in the world. The weak would not be able to witness such an enormous majesty, and even approaching it would be a sin for them. Now, he needed to rely on his own strength to cross this final journey. But after thinking about it again, Marcus couldn't help but sigh again. He chose to give up. "I can't go up," he asked helplessly. "Can't someone help me?" Silence. For a long time, no one responded. In the end, as if someone was sighing helplessly, they stretched out their hand. Above the thunderclouds, a huge shadow and outline quickly emerged, turning into a huge hand that seemed to tear the whole hell apart. It stretched out and gently pinched the wheelchair and the old man in it, lifting him up. After a long period of danger and difficulty, he was sent to the door of the palace, ascending to heaven in a single step. Now, in order to make it convenient for him, even the threshold was removed, allowing him to calmly push the wheelchair straight in. Then he saw in the palace, under the heavy curtains, a figure squatting at the end of a gorgeous short table, holding his chin in boredom. In terms of pure destruction and power, in terms of pure self-power, he deserved to be called the strongest in the abyss. Countless people recognized him. Countless people revered him and submitted to him. The eternal overlord of the Thunder Sea, the ruler of rulers, the king of kings. Thunder Grand Monarch. He didn't have a huge body and height like other giants. When he sat next to the short table specially prepared for guests, his body was less than 2 meters tall, even shorter than a newborn dwarf giant. No matter who looked at him, they would think that he was a handsome and tough man. His upper body was naked, and his arms and chest were engraved with ancient totems. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his short hair was like needles. His eyes seemed to be cast in gold, shining and majestic. Was this specially prepared for me? Marcus looked around at the large and small furnishings and couldn't help but laugh. It's really flattering, Grand Lord. As if bored, the Grand Lord raised his hand, casually picked up the fruits from the realm, and threw them into his mouth. I wanted to embarrass you on purpose. I know. Marcus nodded. I have experienced the necessary etiquette for an audience with a Grand Lord. But why do you have to help me this time? Because you are old, Marcus. The Grand Lord looked at the old friend in front of him, and it was unknown whether his expression was lament or pity. Look, I haven't seen you in such a short time, and your body has become so decayed, pitiful in your twilight years, like iron that has melted in time. Despite this, only your soul is still so beautiful and enchanting. Haha, enchanting? I don't think so. The corners of Marcus' mouth curled up slightly. Maybe your taste is strange, Grand Lord. For hell, is there a treasure better than such a soul? The Grand Lord shook his head and told him patiently, My promise remains unchanged, Marcus. If you come under my command, I will give you the position of ruler. When you experience the eternal joy of hell in my palace, you will understand how ephemeral and fragile everything you love is. Marcus nodded slightly. That's really tempting. But you want to refuse, right? The Grand Lord shook his head indifferently. I don't mind your refusal or anger, but you can think about it. Forget it, your majesty. Marcus shook his head, ignoring the vicious gazes of the rulers on both sides, and replied with a smile, My dream is very beautiful. What you give me can't compare to it. Dead silence. In a brief moment of dead silence, the shoulders of the Grand Lord sitting at the end of the short table trembled slightly, and the whole sea of thunder reverberated with earth-shattering thunder. Like the laughter of the Grand Lord, a terrifying roar reverberated. It ravaged everyone's eardrums. Which side of us is the real hell? Marcus. The senior lord laughed, leaning forward and backward. Which side of us is the crazy one? If there is not enough madness, how can there be the determination to fight hell? Marcus replied calmly, Be crazy over there. Keep your modesty and pride, and love what you love, Marcus. Only you have the privileges I promised, so you can be called a soul that I recognize. The Grand Lord nodded, and no longer tried to retain the treasure that did not belong to him. Instead, he raised his head and asked, So, Marcus, as the emissary of my enemy, why have you come? The remains of the old world. Marcus replied bluntly, Grand Lord, today I want to take back the fragments of Gaia. Chapter 1108. Once he said that, not only the Grand Lord in front of Marcus, but also the rulers prostrating respectfully on both sides of the throne, and even those behind the heavy curtains cast strange gazes at him. Even the lightning flashing in the sky seemed to stagnate for a moment. Everything was silent. Only the diplomat in the wheelchair looked at his enemy. The remains of the old world, the fragments of Gaia. That was the remnant from destruction, essential old Gaia. In fact, if one looked at it as a whole, it might not be appropriate to call it Gaia, and it might be a bit exaggerated to call it the world. That was just a name. It pointed to the world that wanted to destroy humans. In this era of humans, the first-generation world was completely destroyed by the Astronomy Club. This was indeed a helpless move. After all, before that, no one would have thought that there would be something like one in the world. But after losing all the walls formed by the gods, under the radiation of the abyss, the present realm began to gradually distort, gradually breeding malice and hostility against the descendants. Floods and monstrous waves, storms and droughts, lava and raging fire, meteorites falling from the sky and barren land, a strange fog that swallowed everything, and even the darkness that rapidly grew under the crypt. This was the origin of the endless sea, the country of fog, the iron rain wilderness, the hellfire domain, and all the other borders. Before Gaia was destroyed, it was enough to shake the entire world, destroy all civilizations, and kill all humans. Just like the mother who killed her children. When the butcher's knife was raised, what else could the children do but cry? Only the two relied on each other to survive above the abyss formed by the infinite depth. And when one of them deviated from this, everything was pushed to the edge of a precarious cliff. There was only one choice left. If the world wanted to destroy humans, then it had to destroy the world first. If the opponent was too threatening and had to be killed, but at the same time was too important and had to be preserved, then there was only one way left. Harmlessness, the first world destruction plan, and the world creation plan were the miracles of the pioneer society's transformation into the astronomy club. Driven by the power of the entire realm, the miracles were completed by humans. The old world was disintegrated, separated, rebuilt, and then recombined to form a new world. Artificially simulating the cycle of hell, the present realm was reborn. The direct result of this was that the world that wanted to kill humans no longer existed. With the appearance of the three great seals, a brand new world was formed. The present realm, the border, and hell formed a new cycle. As for the old world, it was completely dead. Countless fragments sank into the endless abyss of darkness. The love that had already disappeared, the hatred that could not disappear, the sorrow of being killed by a descendant, the despair of wanting to kill a descendant, and even the eternal pain, perhaps there were still some vital essences. But that was no longer important to the present situation at that time. And now, Marcus was once again bringing up the past. After arriving at the core of the Sea of Lightning, he faced one of the few people who stood at the very top of the abyss and made his request. "Did I make myself clear?" "Grand Monarch," he asked. "It's clear and straightforward. There's no room for misunderstanding." The great dark monarch nodded and studied his appearance, a subtle expression appearing on his human-like face. "Then why didn't you respond to me?" Marcus asked, "Is my sincerity not enough? Or is my visit too abrupt? If you want to follow the old rules, you can throw me down from here and let these old bones of mine climb up from below. Then I'll say the same thing to you again. I'm just waiting." The great dark monarch shook his head regretfully. "I hope you can hesitate a little or think more about your intentions. Friendship is hard to come by, Marcus. For the sake of the courtesy and respect you once showed me, you still have a chance to take back those words. But I've never been the only one who came here, have I?" The diplomat ignored his good intentions and was aggressive, completely ignoring the good intentions of the Supreme. The pair of turbid eyes also widened, showing a solemn expression, and hoarsely declared, "I represent the present realm, the astronomical society, the combination of all the glory and meaning of this world. I am your enemy, Grand Monarch. Why do you despise me so much?" When he began to speak, the voice was no longer that of an old man. In the hoarse voice, there was a will harder than iron and hotter than the sun emerging. He asked solemnly, "Am I not strong enough to be your enemy?" In the silence, only the squatting man across the short table sighed silently. He turned around and walked towards the darkness behind him, towards the throne that was so huge that it seemed to occupy the world. With every step he took, the robust body grew larger, and the thunder in the sky also played a roar. It was as if a giant was trampling on the earth, causing everything to wail. In the end, the throne that broke through the top of the hall and penetrated deep into the thunderclouds once again emerged a huge figure that could fill the whole world. In that case, I can only respond to you directly, Marcus. A pair of dazzling golden eyes appeared on the dark giant's face. It looked down, no longer concealing the coldness and cruelty of a ruler. "The thing you want, the remains you want, is in my hands. Indeed, the dead present realm is useless to me, tasteless to eat, and a pity to throw away, but it is my collection after all. Even among the treasures in the Sea of Thunder, it is enough to rank in the top 5. Why should I give it to you?" In the whistling wind and loud noise on the wheelchair, the old man raised his skinny arms, supported his body with difficulty, and looked up at the king of hell in front of him. "Then why don't we make a bet? How about it?" he said. "In the name of the contract maker, I want to restart the last bet between us, between the present realm and hell." As early as when the Astronomy Society was just established, the surge of the deep tide triggered the first war of worlds in human history. After losing the Wall of Gods, and after Gaia was killed, the present realm was unprotected. In hell, illuminated by the light of the present realm, the huge, sleeping existences woke up with the surge of the deep tide. They looked at the world above their heads. Hunger rumbled. This was a phenomenon that evolved from the cycle of birth and death from the abyss. When a world ushered in the end, the remnants of the past era would once again take everything away, destroy everything, and completely push everything that remained into nothingness. This was like a feast. When the huge present realm fell into the abyss, countless fragments turned into countless hells, and a brand new king of hell would rise from the abyss. Until a long time later, in the eternal darkness in hell, the miracle of a new world was born again. At that time, when the Astronomy Society was just established, the present realm fell into a weak and declining state. In the face of the War of Worlds, what they fought for with all their strength was a bet. The present realm and hell would make 3 bets. In the first time, the outcome of the War of Worlds was decided, and thus they were able to survive the most difficult period. In the second time, both sides won and lost, but it laid the foundation of the Silver Sea. At the same time, it also created the blueprint of the fourth plan, Kingdom of Heaven. And when the Third War of Worlds came, Marcus, who was once a diplomat and representative of the Astronomy Society, once again exercised the rights he had, restarting the contract between the present realm and hell. The last bet, taking back the remains of the old world. Oh, in that short silence, not only on the throne, but even behind the surrounding curtains, the unknown existences who came to watch inevitably made a slight disturbance. Some were surprised, some were contemptuous, and some were excited. But among them, none of them expressed rejection. As one of the participants last time, one of the 6 people who witnessed the contract, you do have such rights. The Grand Lord lowered his eyes and looked down at the opponent in front of him. His finger flicked in disdain, but, "Do you have a bet that is enough to move us?" "Of course," Marcus replied indifferently. He raised his hand and held the contract that had been written long ago. With the present realm's defense line and its associated 30 layers of domains as the chip, on the old face, there was a mocking flame in his eyes. "If you can win, you can take it all. In that case, shall we make a final bet, Mathers?" After a short moment of shock, the Grand Lord couldn't help but sneer. "After losing your city wall, how do you plan to fight? In the last war, did we have something like a city wall?" Marcus raised his head and asked, "Why don't you say a word? Everyone, such a bet is right in front of you. Are you going to hide behind the scenes like rats?" Wither King, Paradise Earth Officiator, Jesters, Eternal World Group, Mother of Stone, Gloomy Eye, and everyone from Golden Dawn. Are you going to keep silent and stay out of this? Following the old man's roar and questioning, behind the layers of curtains, silhouettes slowly appeared one after another. They coldly glanced at the dust in the field. "Ha ha ha, interesting." The Wither King, who was sitting on the blood-colored throne with a wine cup in his hand, happily knocked on the armrest. "Since there is such a grand bet, how can I not participate?" "Mortal, you should be careful with your words." The Paradise Earth Officiator, who was wearing a golden mask, indifferently warned, "Your end and your perfect future are all in the mouth of our God." Aya, look at this person. How embarrassing." Sitting on the high chair, Marcus took off his hat and shrugged helplessly. "In any case, we used to be old friends. Why do you have to be so merciless? Our Lord has already set his eyes on you," the jesters replied dully. "You can perform to your heart's content. If the profits are enough, I don't mind participating." The owner of the Eternal World Group, Workshop Master No. 1, said indifferently, "I'm not interested." A vague voice came from the Mother of Stone, who was like a giant statue. "Do as you wish." Following the appearance of the rulers, It was as if the weight of the entire hell had gradually descended on this place. In the end, in the long silence, the giant lord, who was sitting on the throne, casually flicked his finger. "Not enough," he said. "The chips on both sides are already the same." "Lord," Marcus replied, "the difference in value is not more than 1 point. "That is true, but it is not enough to make me change my mind, Marcus." Above the thunderclouds, the giant silhouette lowered his head and looked down at the newcomers in front of him. There was no longer any pity, only indifference and cruelty. "Your chips are not enough to change my mind." "Then, how about adding me in?" After a long silence on the wheelchair, Marcus grinned and revealed a proud smile. "My soul is here, Lord, even if I am old and insignificant. But if I can change your mind, it should be enough. How about it? Do you want to give it a try?" The stooped old man propped himself up from the wheelchair, took a step forward, and proudly spread his arms. "Can you make the flag of the utopia fall from my hands?" Just like that, under the gaze of the Lord, he arrogantly raised his head. He waited for the final reply. What responded to him was the thunder that shook the entire abyss and the laughter that echoed in countless hells. "Very good, very good. You are indeed the best opponents, enough to be my enemy." The Lord nodded in satisfaction. "How do you want to bet, Marcus? Whether it is gladiatorial combat, knowledge, or even anything else, I am willing to accompany you." "Then let's still use the old way. How about it?" Marcus raised his hand and replied solemnly. "If you want to decide the outcome between the present realm and hell, what could be more realistic than the duel between the countless records of events between the present realm and hell?" When he raised his hand, the outline of a card rose from his aged fingertips and slowly rotated. The frame, color, and even the pattern and name on the card were changing constantly. The miracles created by countless souls, the harm caused by countless degenerates, every disaster, every redemption, every destruction, and every rebirth were all recorded in the book. The magnificent light illuminated every pair of eyes in the darkness. "Then let's begin, people of the present realm." At that moment, the abyss roared. On the throne, the Lord raised his hands as if he was holding the axis of hell tightly. The light of thunder crisscrossed between the countless depths, causing the mighty and majestic voice to spread. "Announce to hell, announce to the present realm, announce to every inch of the place. Let's use your methods and the things you seek as the stage. The Supreme King is announcing to the entire realm. The abyss gamble to determine the ownership of the old world begins now." At that moment, in the continuation courtyard, Huaisher woke up from his dream. Opening his eyes, he heard the thunder in the distance. Since 3 days ago, he had been arranged to be alone in the examination room, receiving various inspections from the continuation courtyard and meticulous maintenance, including his 3 meals and bathing time. It began a long wait. At that moment, the door opened and 008 stepped in. His footsteps hurried. "Get ready, Mr. Huaisher." The notice from the continuation courtyard was officially issued. "It's your turn to appear." Chapter 1109. Suddenly, Huaisher had no time to react, but instinctively looked around for his equipment. "But there's nothing here. There's only one rice bowl, which hasn't been finished yet. I don't know if it can be used on a battlefield." "Are you sure?" Huaisher asked doubtfully. "Don't look for it," 008 replied. "Those things can't be used. You can only rely on yourself." "Do you have to tell me what's going on?" Huaisher followed behind him as they walked through the complicated corridors. She was confused. "There should be a limit to how much secrets can be kept. We need you to be ready to make sure that your mental state is stable and you can do your best at any time," 008 said without looking back. "You will be thrown into a war as a gladiator, Mr. Huaisher. You are a pawn and a tool. You have to defeat your enemy and win. Everyone who comes here has to. You have to help each other against hell." Behind 008, Huaisher subconsciously looked up at the top of his head. It's as if you can see a yellow exclamation mark emerging from the top of his head. It's pleasant. "I'm too familiar with this." Huaisher skillfully skipped the plot and asked directly, "Where is the enemy? How many to kill? How to kill?" "Everywhere. Everywhere, you can kill until you can't kill. As for decapitation or other things, it's up to you. Later, all the questions you have will be answered in the memory of the infusion. In front of the slowly opened door, 008's footsteps stopped and pointed to the complex instrument that unfolded like a cabin. "Please, Mr. Huaishur." Under the gloomy light, there was a chilling atmosphere. The premonition of death seemed to begin to creep up, but soon it disappeared. Huaishur scratched his head. Stride in. The hatch closed and darkness came. In front of another cabin, Ms. Chun smoked a cigarette and squinted at 091 beside her. "Soul extraction chamber? I know you bad guys don't have good fart." 091 was unmoved, and the electronic voice was calm. "I promise, this is one of the necessary steps." "Then what are we waiting for?" Madame Chun extinguished the cigarette with her foot and walked in with a sigh. She closed her eyes and said, "Hurry up." Slap! A crisp sound rang out. "Data extraction. Begin." In the same enclosed room, the burly old man was still squatting beside the extraction chamber and muttering to himself. "Don't be afraid. Everyone has their first time. It's inevitable that they'll be nervous. I've been through this before. I just need to close my eyes and it'll be over. Let's just perform normally. Don't feel pressured. Safety first, competition second. Don't always rush forward blindly. That's enough. Go to your work." Under the heavy cable entanglement, Liz rolled her eyes and waited for him. "Am I a child in kindergarten?" Trier was stunned for a moment. He couldn't help but scratch the wrinkles on his face. "Who is it in front of me?" Liz was silent and speechless. The old man smiled and reached out his hand to stroke her hair. "Protect yourself and be careful, Liz. I know you too." Liz nodded. "Of course." The old man raised his head proudly. The hatch closed. In the darkness, he saw the light of the shadowless lamp and a few hurried figures. "Mr. Kamiyazumi is about to die," someone shouted. "The stasis zone can no longer seal the soul. We have to, then there's no need to seal it," an indifferent voice said coldly. A cold electronic voice spoke. "Perform soul extraction and transfer. Inject 5 units of outer path poison. After a repair operation, transfer him to the essence pool. Just keep him alive for a single breath." After a short pause, a cold mask covered the patient's face. The last thing he heard was the emotionless, cold words. It was as if he had entrusted a wisp of hope. "The time has come for your wish, Mr. Kamiyazumi," he said. "I wish you good luck." Here, there, in the preparation area of the entire isolation zone, in front of thousands of soul extraction chambers, one figure after another walked into them. Layers of cables wrapped around them. Cold liquid origin substance poured into them, extracting, transforming, and preserving souls. Under the projection of the silver ocean, flashes of light flowed like stars in the dark shadows of the Continuation Academy, flying to hell, throwing themselves into their own war. At this moment, in the Palace of the Thunder Ocean, the sound of cracking and shattering could be heard. The earth collapsed, and the stone slabs shattered and evaporated. Under the will of the Grand Lord, a huge fragment slowly materialized here, projecting a huge and lonely world in the air, just like the dead present realm. It was a scene of devastation. The fragment of the old Gaia still retained its appearance when it fell. Since the antecedent killed it, it fell into a stagnant time. Only a large number of disasters and miracles surged in it, changing constantly. This was the battlefield of the struggle, the chessboard of chess. At the same time, it was also the final bet. Behind Marcus' wheelchair, countless brilliance descended from the sky. After crossing a long distance, a rainbow bridge was transmitted, and one figure after another walked out from it. The chess players from the present realm had arrived. In addition to Isaac, who stood calmly behind Marcus after entering, there were 9 other candidates from different parts of the world. There was a slightly bloated old nun holding a rosary in her hand. There was an Indian man with a long white beard whose headscarf was full of jewels. There was a middle-aged man wearing a spotless white suit and sunglasses who looked like a gambler. There was even the inconspicuous creator, Nakajima, in the middle. There was also the Dongsha ascendant at the back, looking left and right, trying to take a selfie with his phone. By Zay. 5 main candidates, 5 reserves, Marcus said. Marcus said, our chess players are all here. Senior Lord, what about your side's players? On the throne, the Grand Lord glanced at the dust under his feet. After a long time, he looked to his side. Have you seen enough? He said, send out a few, so that people won't be jealous that I represent the abyss. In front of me? You're still too early. The King of Withered laughed mockingly and pointed to the front. He ordered his subordinate beside him. White Snake, since they have pretended to invite me, you will go up and play chess for me. The old jester bowed. I will not disappoint your majesty. It doesn't matter if you lose. The King of Withered waved his hand casually. You don't have to feel pressured. Just do your best. It's just a gamble. Pleasure is the right thing to do. As long as it's not a sticky and unpleasant stalemate, I will be very satisfied whether it's a crushing defeat or a great victory. Yes. White Snake accepted the order with a bitter smile and turned to walk to the chessboard. He also heard the king he was loyal to order behind him. Hey, you, bring some fries and prawns from the present realm. It's just right for me to pass the time. At a time like this, he still wants his subordinates to eat for him. White Snake's footsteps paused. He was under a lot of pressure. Tiancheng, you go. The messenger of the Pied Piper glanced at the follower beside him. I hope you understand something. Yes. The pale and stooped jester stepped forward with his walking stick. If I had known, I would have let Edward take this job. Mather sighed and got up from his chair. He walked to the other side of the Gaia fragment and bowed to the old man in the wheelchair. This time, I'll have to trouble you again. In the wheelchair, Marcus calmly looked at the projection in front of him, indifferent. The traitor of Golden Dawn didn't seem to care. He smiled and shuffled the pile of cards that appeared in his hand. He was full of anticipation. The rancher's beloved ruler, Archangel Justice, walked out of the door of paradise and received the order to make a sacrifice. The Eye of Obscurity sent out a descendant. In the squirming mud, half of a pale body appeared. He held a card in his hand, and his incomplete face was expressionless. Finally, under the seat of the Grand Lord, a thin figure in gray clothes walked out. His skin was bronze and covered in scars and tattoos. His appearance was even more handsome than the Grand Lord. It was hard to tell if he was a man or a woman. However, one of his eyes was blind and lifeless. There was an unsettling haze lingering in his empty eyes. The ruler of the Sea of Thunder, the beloved of the Moon of Decay and the Blue Tide, the youngest son of the Grand Lord. Mantong. Just like that, when the players from Hell gradually got into position, the Grand Lord on the throne asked again, Are you ready, Marcus? We can start at any time. The old man in the wheelchair answered. Then let's start. If there are any tricks or strategies or even any cheating methods that can't be discovered, you can use them to your heart's content. But don't forget, Marcus, you're also one of the stakes. The Grand Lord announced coldly, You're standing on the scale, but our bet is settled in real time. Do you understand? Of course. Marcus nodded, still smiling. From the moment the bet started, the situation on the field would determine the increase or decrease of the stakes. If the situation of the astronomy conference was good, then the fragment of Gaia would gradually transform into the present state. But if it wasn't good, then the defense line of the present state, including the 30 layers, would gradually disappear without a trace. At the same time, it would also affect Marcus. The state of his soul would be controlled by the situation of victory or defeat. Whether it rose or fell, it would no longer be up to him. Instead, it would be tortured as the players fought, hovering between sublimation and solidification. Now, let's decide who will make the first move, everyone. Marcus raised his eyes. 2 of the chess players from the realm of reality and hell took a step forward. The man from India and the white snake under the withered king. Standing in front of the dice board, the 2 looked at each other expressionlessly. First, the Indian man took the initiative to spread out his hands to show his modesty. But the white snake didn't appreciate it. She coldly picked up the dice and threw it. 6 points. Full value. The Indian man smiled, picked up the dice, and threw it on the dice board. 6 points. Also full value. Both sides were equal, so they could only roll again. Behind Marcus, Isaac frowned slightly and clenched his fists in his sleeves. The dice thrown by the white snake spun strangely in the dice board and stopped. 5 points. Looks like I'm in luck. The Indian man smiled, picked up the dice, and threw it again. But the dice didn't roll. After it fell from his hand, it fell straight on the dice board. Again, it was 5 points. The Indian player froze on the spot. The two of them looked at each other, and their gazes became meaningful. This time, when White Snake threw the dice again, the result was a 3. Average value. After a long silence, the Indian man reached out and picked up the dice on the board. He held it tightly and threw it down. The dice seemed to have gone crazy, bouncing crazily on the plate, letting out screeching cries and spinning at a very fast speed. Isaac's fingers flicked in his sleeves, but the dice didn't respond. It continued to spin wildly under the white snake's solemn gaze. It gradually slowed down, but the numbers on the 6 sides were fluctuating, shaking violently and flickering. In the end, cracks appeared all over, and a cracking sound was heard. Finally, it stopped at 4 points. Looks like I won. The Indian man smiled helplessly. He raised his hand and scratched his sagging eye bags. His well-maintained palm was already covered with wrinkles and age spots. The stale smell quickly dissipated. Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you. He nodded to Marcus, glanced at Isaac, and returned to his seat with a smile. The first player was decided. The blood hidden in the dark couldn't be seen. Only Isaac calmly put his hands behind his back and hid the crack in his palm. Sargon's dice. In the central decision-making room of the Central Bureau, Xin Yao sighed with pity. He turned around and asked, "Isn't such a sacrifice a little too big?" It was a miracle marked brewed in the epic war recorded in Breaking in Bharat, the bloody battle between the Pandu and Kuru, the struggle between the 5 sons of Hardened War and the 100 sons of Hardened War. It was the reappearance of history. The glib-tongued Sargon lured the leader of the 5 sons of Hardened War to gamble with him. Through the dice made from the bones of his biological father, he won Hardened War's property, status, and even wife and brothers. He beat the God's blessed law maintainer into the dust, forcing the other party to leave his home. In the end, because of this set of dice that he was so proud of, he died in Krishna's scheme. As for his ending, the moment he used that set of dice, it had already been decided. The karma born from going against the gods, the backlash caused by rashly changing fate. Every point he gained would be lost 1,000 times in the future. It was the same for the person who used this miracle mark. The greater the gain, the more shocking the change, and the more terrifying the debt and karma in one's fate would be in the future. The price of gaining the upper hand in the abyssal gamble was enough to make himself, his family, and even his descendants unable to repay it for generations. They would sink into eternal pain. Anidro's sacrifice is his contribution to the present realm. As his brother, I have no right to interfere. The leader of the Indian maintenance genealogy, Sandhu, calmly replied, "It's just a matter of course. There's no need to feel emotional, Your Excellency, Mystic Bird. It's just a pity." Mystic Bird sighed softly. "If it's not a problem, I can borrow the white wolf hook for the time being." "No need. The maintenance genealogy has its own way." Sandhu smoked quietly. His green eyes were calm and expressionless. Or perhaps he had already shed all his tears, and the game had already begun. Stars constantly fell into the chessboard formed by the old Gaia according to the will of the chess player. In Isaac's hand, the stack of 6 cards that had just been drawn shook slightly without even looking at them. After an instant of flickering, they seemed to become different and then flickered again. Under the hem of the robe, the faces of the cards kept changing until finally they returned to calmness. He flipped out a sentry post without looking at it and threw it into the chessboard. After occupying the maze area in the middle of the chessboard, he took advantage of the cost of the sentry post land card to throw in a sublimator. Midnight Storm. The soul of the sublimator descended from the sky and entered the chessboard. Pass. In the first round, no matter who played first, both sides did not do anything other than play land cards and throw in a few low-cost creatures. The most important thing was to occupy the miracle source point and important terrain marked on the chessboard. They were not in a hurry to fight. However, when the second round arrived, Isaac's faint gaze landed on the city that was shrouded in white that was occupied by the other side. It made the white snake's heart suddenly shrink for a moment. Vigilance. But it did not understand where this uneasy premonition came from. Until in the oppressive atmosphere that made people unable to breathe, Isaac flipped his wrist and pushed out a card toward the city occupied by the white snake. Prince of Paradise, why sure? What the hell? The white snake's eyes began to twitch violently, and it was furious. Where did you get the cost and resources? Moreover, you don't have a land card here. No, I have one. Isaac replied calmly and pushed another card toward the projection of the battlefield, floating in front of the white snake. The moment the second round began, Isaac's attack had already arrived in front of the white snake. The classic spell of the Utopia card deck. From the Abyss. That was a unique tactic developed under the super compatibility of Celestial Genealogy and the Abyss. In short, designate a production unit in the Infernal Realm and forcefully requisition it to become your own land card. After using it, it will be destroyed immediately. Your land is very good, but now it's mine, and I won't leave it for you later. Oh, it's getting interesting. The Withered King, who was holding the potato chips, paused for a moment and smiled. At that moment, the sound of collapse came from the city occupied by the white snake. The gates of hell quickly fell apart and was replaced by a sentry post that rose from the ground. Light rose and received the meteor from the present realm. Fall! Waves spread, and wherever it passed, the earth burst out with a roar. In the rising light, as the meteor entered, a brand new body was quickly cast from the light. Spine, internal organs, limbs, head, and even hair and clothes. In the blink of an eye, it was reborn from the darkness. After completing its mission, the simple sentry post exploded with a bang and disappeared without a trace. At that moment, Huaisher finally opened his eyes after a long wait. Just like that, the tool was thrown under the nose of the infernal chess players by the vice president, whom he trusted so much a cold wind and snow blew in his face. In front of him were ruins frozen in ice, a dilapidated city drowned in snow and cold wind. Dozens of wind and frost pillars fell from the collapsed overpass. Under the strong wind, it let out a whimper. As Huaisher breathed, precious heat turned into white mist and rose into the sky. This was the world that had long died. Old Gaia. Chapter 11:10. Thank you, Guild Master Gaji. The instant teleportation brought him a long-lost dizziness and confusion. However, through the memories from the Continuation Institute, he quickly understood his current situation. The cause and effect unfolded in his mind like a compressed package, bringing the shock and emotion that every tool should have. This time, he had really become a tool through and through. Everyone else was playing cards, but he was the card. He might as well do it in one go. And the stakes were the direction of the upcoming war of the worlds and the safety of the current situation. When he raised his head and took a deep breath in the world of ice and snow, he felt a stabbing pain in his lungs. An unprecedented weakness made him shiver in the cold wind, and every snowflake that fell on his body could cause needle-like wounds. Super low temperature. In front of his eyes, the entire city that had turned into ruins was shrouded in an unusual cold, making people suspect that even their souls were about to be frozen by the cold wind. What was worse was that this body, only grade 2, the status that appeared in the Book of Destiny, was no longer the status bar he was familiar with, but another card that he hadn't seen in a long time. Prince of Paradise, Ascendant. It was as if his status had been fixed at the Mountain Ghost stage. Apart from the abilities of the ordinary Mountain Ghost, everything else had disappeared, and there were two more inherent skills. Mountain Ghost. When in a forest, Huaisher's HP will double according to the number of forests, and every attack will recover HP equivalent to the number of forests. Prince. Enemy female characters' attack and defense will be reduced by 1, and all female characters' attack and defense will be increased by 1. it could only be said that it was a relatively ordinary early character. After all, the attack and defense of a Grade 2 Ascendant was completely useless. If it was Prince's effect, it would be a good skill, but it was limited to females. The only thing that stood out was the Mountain Ghost skill. It could recover HP, and it increased according to the number of forest cards, and every attack had a healing effect. In some situations, it could temporarily act as a health bowl at a low cost, allowing the cannon fodder's mission to last longer. It was a little better than some cards that could only be used as toys, but it was also limited. The overall evaluation could only be said to be ordinary. This was Huaishi's current state. Other than the Sword of Virtue, he had no other equipment, no forging furnace, no alchemy fire, and he couldn't even use his soul ability. It was a complete blank slate. The moment he appeared, he instinctively operated his divine mark and soul, trying to communicate with the local vitality, but he felt nothing. There were no plants here. All living things had died long ago. In addition, no matter how he tried to sense it, he was unable to extract any origin substance from the air. His entire body was locked in a card state. Due to Isaac's embarrassing act of snatching the floor, his entire body was in a state of fatigue. Most importantly, he was about to freeze to death, shivering in the cold wind. The extreme cold was ravaging his body at every moment. Even a sublimator could not endure this terrifying winter that could freeze even steel. There was probably only one silver lining in all the misfortunes. He lowered his head and looked at his hands. He took a deep breath. His heart suddenly skipped a beat. Dispelling the spasms in his four limbs, he activated Overload. With the crazy consumption of heat, the cold wind was blocked by the boiling blood, and everything returned to normal. Although the consumption of physical strength was also accelerating, at least he avoided the tragic fate of freezing to death in the ice and snow. Especially Boom. At that moment, a burning flame suddenly appeared in the sky above Huaishi's head. In the earth-shattering sound, the thick dark clouds seemed to be burned red. A huge meteorite fell from the sky. Wrapped in disaster and despair, the friction produced blazing flames, tore through the cold wind, penetrated the collapsed ruins, and smashed to the ground. A strange palace-like building emerged from the peeling meteorite, and under the crack in the ground, dazzling flames and lava spewed out. Palace of Descent. The moment the term began, the white snake did not hesitate to smash the brand-new ground. Then, the second card fell from the crack in the lava, and the sticky boiling sound spread. Then, a twisted palm suddenly stretched out from the lava and pressed on the frozen ground, making a sizzling sound. Under the double envelopment of the wind, snow, and lava, many bodies covered in pitch-black stony skin slowly crawled out from the lava. Their human-like silhouettes were emitting waves of high heat. They held huge swords and axes formed from obsidian in their hands, crying out loudly. Everywhere they passed by, the ground was set ablaze, leaving behind charred footprints. Soon, all the monsters born from the lava turned their heads in unison and looked at Huaishi. Their big mouths full of sharp teeth curled up as if they were grinning ferociously. A total of 162 monsters. With the White Snake's Hell card set, live and die together. After connecting with the other lands of the same faction and obtaining enough power, he finally threw in the solidified souls from Hell. Large group, fire cast remnants. At this moment, the burning crimson and pitch-black colors had already surrounded Huaishi. There was no way to escape. Is this what you want? White Snake raised his eyes and looked at Isaac. You sent your lucky mascot right under my nose, entering deep into the enemy's territory alone without any help, just to let him die a horrible death? 2 mistakes. Isaac's fingers tapped on the back of the card covering the table, and he replied calmly. First of all, Mr. Huaishi's is not a mascot. Second, someone might die a horrible death. He paused for a moment, and a strange look appeared on his solemn face. But it will definitely not be him. Along with his words, a tragic scream rose from the domain of Frozen City. Right in front of Huaishi's A fire-cast demon knelt on the ground in horror, unable to support his broken right leg. Then he saw that right in front of him, Huaishur clenched his fist, aiming at his head. And then, triple drummer, thunderbolt. A loud, thunderous sound spread out, and a headless corpse fell to the sky, quickly collapsing into lava and gravel. Only Huaishur slowly raised his head and looked at the enemies who surrounded him. He couldn't help but smile. I just felt cold, and someone sent charcoal to my door. Are you some hellish charity organization coming to rescue me? Under his feet, cracks suddenly appeared in the snow and ice. A huge wave spread under the trampling. In an instant, it swept past countless collapsed and broken buildings, flew into the distance, and disappeared. But even so, all the hellish creatures present felt an unprecedented uneasiness in their hearts. It was as if they had been swallowed into the stomach of some terrifying behemoth, and they felt suffocated for no reason. Before his smile, "Your heartbeats are very good," Huaishur praised. "Although soon, they won't be able to jump anymore." Boom! Another thunderous sound burst out from the large group, from under Huaishur's feet, all the way to the end of the formation. Everywhere it passed, everything fell apart under the whirling and slashing of the axe of wrath. It was as if a scar had been torn apart. Lava that resembled blood splashed out, burning this city that had been frozen for countless years. And death at that moment came in Huaishur's hands. The tragic ravaging and killing came without reason. Holding the axe of wrath and the sword of virtue, Huaishur stepped forward and destroyed everything that could still move in front of him. The sound of the wind blowing in the sky, the remaining echoes of the tremors deep in the earth, the scattered noises of the falling snow, and even the crisp whine of the ice breaking. Even the breathing of a large group, the beating of the heart of lava, and their roars. For a moment, everything was seamlessly combined into one, as if it was supposed to be like this. Under the resonance, Huaishur grasped it in his hand. Mastery, symphony. At this moment, a power that surpassed cognition descended on the body of the mountain ghost. It was not a power brought about by a miracle, nor was it a gift from hell. It was just a person's will and skill that pried open the cruel reality. With oneself as the fulcrum, the power of heaven and earth. Even if his body was so weak compared to Yun Zhongjuan, Huaishur's power, which was hundreds of times stronger than his, wantonly ravaged the enemies in front of him. In the end, among the countless solidified lava and broken limbs, only a figure was left, in the broken hall of descent in front of him. The style is too uncoordinated, my friend. Huaishur sighed softly and raised his head. It was as if he could see the gloomy expression of the white snake through the eternal snow and dark clouds. In his hand, the sword of virtue lit up with a bright glow. It was aimed at the hall of descent in front of him. Since it's an illegal building, no one will complain about me if I tear it down, right? Tens of thousands of streams of light gathered on the blade and rose. After merging with Huaishur's origin form, it quickly turned into a fierce light that tore through the dark clouds and darkness. The fierce light rose and shrouded the silent city once again. It illuminated Huaishur's mocking smile. Just like that, it slashed toward the hall of descent from hell. In the roar, the remains of the meteorite fell apart. In a violent collapse, a loud sound echoed. Soon, no traces of the past could be seen. Only the ruins remained in the ruins. It was harmonious and merged into one. As the dust gradually dissipated in the cold wind, only Huaishur's figure walked out of it. Like a character who had just appeared, he smiled at all the audience. He raised his hands and made a heart sign. "Love you." Unfortunately, no one responded. Until now, the voice of the vice principal finally sounded in Huaishur's ears. "It seems that you're doing well." "Not at all, not at all. It's all because of the warm welcome of the people from hell." Huaishur scratched his head and casually found a seat to sit down. He asked curiously, "It's just that I don't remember when Mr. Isaac started to be so heartless." Isaac was silent for a long time and sighed apologetically. "Let me tell you a piece of bad news. According to the advice the principal left me before I set off, in the early stages of the situation with limited resources, I need to first strengthen Ms. Chen's combat strength. The existence of Anubis is crucial to the entire battle situation. Therefore, I'm afraid you can only play to your strengths, Mr. Huaishur. He said, do as you wish. You can take whatever you want. That old bastard is such a bastard? Huaishur was stunned. What if I die? Is he finally going to make a move on me? A little kitten? That's another piece of good news. Isaac replied, the principal stuffed 5 of your cards into my deck. This means that you can die 5 times. He added meaningfully, that's right, at least. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.